Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of our story. If you like this what if story and want to see part 2, let me know in the comments below. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Also, check the description for more great content and my playlist. This story was posted by 𝐼𝐻𝐼𝐬_𝐃𝐞𝐭𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐬 on Wattpad. Now let's start. As part of his routine, Izuku checked both doors to his right, confirming that 𝗏𝗏𝐽 was not nearby, even though he already knew that. He also ensured that his classmates were not watching him, just as he had done a few minutes earlier. Their teacher's voice trailed off as he mentioned 𝗏𝗏𝐽's aspirations. The classroom buzzed with chatter, with students speculating about 𝗏𝗏𝐽's chances of getting into a school with a mere 0.2% acceptance rate for its hero course. While his classmates debated, Izuku remained silent, hoping their teacher wouldn't bring up the other student who had chosen 𝐻𝐬 as his first choice, back when he thought just submitting the school's name would be enough motivation. He was uncertain about taking the entrance exam. If he were accepted, though that seemed unlikely, would it be worth it to try? He wanted to believe it was. As 𝗏𝗏𝐽 boasted about becoming the next All Might, Izuku kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the scratched surface of his desk. The numerous carvings of Quirkless had been scratched out and replaced with villain and thief. Usually, he hid those words beneath one of his notebooks, but he had already packed his materials away. Now, he stared at the words, clenching his teeth hard enough to make his jaw ache. Eventually, he forced himself to look away and shifted his arm to cover the most offensive carvings. 𝗏𝗏𝐽 then directed his attention to Izuku, freezing in his position atop his desk, where he had jumped during his rant about his future as the #1 hero. The arrogant grin on his face twisted into a scowl as he glared at Izuku. The rest of the class erupted into whispers, and with each comment, Izuku felt himself shrinking further into his seat. His cheeks grew uncomfortably warm as he hid the lower half of his face behind his arms, trying to shield himself while still keeping an eye on the classroom. He fought back tears, hoping his classmates wouldn't notice. 𝗏𝗏𝐽 jumped down from his desk, causing Izuku to look up quickly, aware that 𝗏𝗏𝐽 would interpret any reaction as a sign of his inferiority. He hoped to escape the situation unscathed. With a scowl, 𝗏𝗏𝐽 stomped over to Izuku's desk and slammed a hand down on its surface, causing an explosion of energy to spark between his fingertips. The force of the blast sent Izuku back against the wall behind his chair. Sparks crackled around 𝗏𝗏𝐽 as he leaned closer, glaring down at Izuku, who cowered beneath his gaze. They both understood that Izuku wouldn't dare challenge 𝗏𝗏𝐽's quirk. Izuku pressed himself against the wall, his eyes darting around in search of an escape route, even though he knew them by heart. He understood that bolting away would only provoke 𝗏𝗏𝐽 further, leading to a more severe reaction than the one he might receive if he navigated the encounter carefully. So, he bit his tongue, feeling the pain but not enough to draw BLD, and dug his fingernails into the wooden floor. Protecting his face with his hands wouldn't help, so he refrained from doing so. 𝗏𝗏𝐽 dismissed his classmates, claiming they had inferior quirks, and questioned whether Izuku truly believed he could become a hero. His eyes narrowed as he challenged Izuku's aspirations. No matter what Izuku said, 𝗏𝗏𝐽 would always assume the worst. It was clear to Izuku that he was weaker, yet for reasons he couldn't understand, 𝗏𝗏𝐽 never accepted his words. It was as if 𝗏𝗏𝐽 needed confirmation that Izuku understood his place. Whatever the reason, Izuku could only speak the truth, believing that the worst reaction to honesty would be better than any lie he could fabricate. He admitted to 𝗏𝗏𝐽 that he knew he couldn't compete and expressed uncertainty about applying to 𝐻𝐬 anymore. 𝗏𝗏𝐽 seemed to relish this admission, and Izuku kept his gaze fixed on 𝗏𝗏𝐽's face, bracing himself for the consequences. He bit down on the inside of his cheek, tasting the tang of BLD, and kept his lips sealed. Agreeing with 𝗏𝗏𝐽 would only result in more pain, adding to the scars already on his skin. Before 𝗏𝗏𝐽 could respond further, their teacher intervened, instructing them to calm down and take their seats. Izuku flinched at the fierce glare 𝗏𝗏𝐽 directed at him, the most intense scowl he had seen that day. After a moment that felt like an eternity, 𝗏𝗏𝐽 turned and returned to his desk at the front of the classroom. Once seated and looking straight ahead, Izuku quietly picked himself off the floor and took his place in the back, the closest seat to the door he could manage that year. His fingers traced over the crude carvings on his desk as tears threatened to spill, but he refused to let them fall. To steady himself, he pressed down on his left shoulder with the heel of his palm, feeling the pain shoot through his skin. Taking a deep breath, he blinked back his tears and focused on the teacher, who was speaking about something important. His hand itched for his latest hero analysis notebook, but he knew better than to leave it in his backpack. It had been years since he last made that mistake, especially after Bakugo had burned one of his notebooks right in front of him. Since then he had kept it safe in his bedroom, knowing that writing in his hero journals usually helped him relieve stress, if he didn't dwell on the possibility that all his efforts could be in vain. With his fingers playing with the strap of his backpack and his leg bouncing under the desk, Izuku waited for the bell. If Bakugo called out to him as soon as it rang, he would have to stay, and darting out of the room before Bakugo could reach him would only lead to a worse outcome the next day. However, if Bakugo remained silent, Izuku would take that chance. Izuku hoped that the punishment he would face the next day would be no worse than usual. He rarely forgot, or more accurately, he was rarely in a better mood, but he could still hope. The bell rang across campus. As Izuku hesitated for a moment, Bakugo approached him, looming over his seat. He had his hands in his pockets and a challenging demeanor. Bakugo demanded to know if Izuku had finally learned his place, and Izuku knew exactly how he should respond. He bowed his head, nodded slightly, and remained silent. Bakugo remarked that it seemed Izuku had given up on being a hero, clearly seeking confirmation. Izuku focused on Bakugo's shoes and admitted that he didn't think there was a point. Bakugo laughed, declaring that Izuku could only ever be a quirk-stealing villain. He taunted Izuku, suggesting that if he truly didn't want to be a villain, he should pray for a decent quirk in his next life and consider ending it all. Izuku bit down HRD on his tongue, tasting BLD, and let his hair fall to cover his face. He carefully observed Bakugo's shoes, knowing that if Bakugo was about to strike, he would recognize the signs. Bakugo continued, suggesting that instead of ending his life, Izuku should embrace becoming a villain so that Bakugo could confront him when he became a pro-hero. Izuku forced himself to look up, meeting Bakugo's gaze. He knew his expression was pitiful, but he hoped it would satisfy Bakugo enough to disarm him. The silence stretched on until Bakugo slammed his hand down on Izuku's desk, causing him to flinch. With a laugh, Bakugo stepped away, stating that it wasn't worth the effort to burn him. Once alone, Izuku grabbed his bag with trembling fingers, his eyes fixed on the clock as the seconds ticked by agonizingly slowly. After 10 minutes, feeling confident, he wouldn't run into Bakugo or his friends, he hoisted his bag onto his shoulder, a task made easy by years of practice. The walk home felt longer than usual, but that had been the case for years. Izuku trudged along, repeating to himself that he wasn't a villain and wouldn't become one, despite the quirk that seemed to define him. As he approached the underpass he passed every day, he swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his tongue as he focused on the pain to regain control of his thoughts. The warmth of the sunlight faded as he entered the shade of the bridge. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, he noticed the sewer grate ahead shifting. He stopped, furrowing his brows as it jerked open. Too late, he realized something was coming toward him. A mass of sludge surged in his direction, coiling around his waist and pinning his arms to his sides. He struggled helplessly, his nails scraping against nothing, his muscles refusing to cooperate. The slime clogged his nose, and panic surged as he opened his mouth, desperate for air. The sludge invaded his throat, and he felt a wave of pain that threatened to overwhelm him. He was on the brink of suffocation. With the last remnants of his strength, he forced his fingers to spread, despite every instinct telling him not to. The effort drained him, and he collapsed into darkness. Izuku jolted awake to the sound of someone speaking loudly, enough to make his head throb. He checked his throat, only to realize he was encased in the same slime that had trapped him before. The urge to panic rose within him. A deep, familiar voice asked if he was all right. Looking up, he saw the towering figure of the pro-hero who inspired millions, the one Bakugo aspired to become. Izuku managed to breathe out the name, All Might. All Might expressed relief that Izuku was okay and apologized for the mix-up during his villain hunt, gesturing to a man tied up behind him. He then inquired about Izuku's quirk, mentioning that he almost apprehended him instead of the villain. Izuku lowered his head, allowing his messy hair to shield his eyes as he stared at All Might's shoes. He hesitated to answer, feeling the weight of the moment. Finally, he admitted that his quirk allowed him to take another person's quirk and use it as his own. He nodded, eyes downcast, and gauged All Might's reaction. The pro-hero maintained a smile, but it was tight around the edges, revealing his struggle to respond without being harsh. Izuku acknowledged that it was a villain's quirk, attempting a smile that felt awkward and unconvincing. He then asked if he could return the quirk to its owner. All Might affirmed that he could. He retrieved 2 plastic bottles from his pockets, and Izuku marveled at how they fit, even in his cargo shorts. It felt unusual to see him out of his hero costume, but the villain must have caught him during a rare moment of downtime. He resolved to wrestle the villain into the bottles when the time came to use his quirk. Izuku nodded and stood up slowly, struggling to suppress his quirk. He shuffled toward the man, dropping to his knees and reaching out. He placed a cold, slimy hand on the villain's arm, willing the quirk to return to its rightful owner. After a few tense seconds of trying to consciously use a quirk for the first time in 7 years, it finally worked. As he expelled the sludge from his body, the injuries he had sustained from the attacks surged to the forefront of his mind. His throat felt raw, and each breath ignited a fire in his lungs. Yet, he could manage it. It was necessary for someone in his position. Perhaps the constant ache in his joints, which had developed a few years prior, was to blame for the adjustment. Or perhaps it was just Bakugo. All Might forced the villain's body, now transformed into sludge, into the plastic bottles, the man unable to evade the powerful blows from All Might's punches. The air surged with the sheer force of his strikes. Once he had secured the villain behind the plastic, he turned back to Izuku. He explained that a quirk only becomes villainous if the user is a villain, emphasizing that it is the actions taken with it that determine its nature. Izuku stared at him, questioning whether All Might truly believed that. All Might assured him he did. Izuku wondered if he could really become a hero, even with his quirk, even when others disagreed. For a moment, All Might hesitated, but his smile remained steadfast. Izuku tensed, but All Might affirmed that while it would be difficult, he believed Izuku could be a hero. At that moment, Izuku felt a wave of emotion wash over him, tears streaming down his face, but he was smiling too. He could be a hero. Had he ever heard those words before? All Might then suggested that Izuku consider applying to you. Izuku tilted his head, wondering if this was related to the rumors of All Might becoming a teacher there this year. He nodded, sniffling, admitting that he had considered it. It had been his dream school. All Might encouraged him to apply, stating that he had a good chance of being admitted into the hero course. Izuku opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. He had mostly stopped crying, but uncertainty lingered. He wondered if All Might was merely suggesting this to placate him, given that he possessed a quirk often associated with villains. If All Might crushed his dreams now, he might feel compelled to follow the expected path since the day his quirk manifested. Was All Might merely trying to control a potential threat? No, he dismissed that thought. Here was the symbol of peace, telling him what he had longed to hear for nearly a decade. Izuku chose to trust him. Even if All Might had ulterior motives, he had still said Izuku could become a hero. Why would he lie about that? Would he deceive him when, if it were impossible, Izuku would eventually come to the same conclusion and succumb to despair? Maybe he really could be a hero. All Might not know personally if it were possible, as his quirk was too heroic for that. While Izuku couldn't name a hero with a quirk truly comparable to his, he was familiar with nearly every pro-hero in hero-centric countries, including Japan's underground heroes. There were those with seemingly villainous quirks. The existence of a top 10 list of heroes with villainous quirks was proof enough. Perhaps Izuku could indeed enter a hero course, become a hero, and prove to everyone that villainous quirks were a misconception. He asked if All Might really believed in him, realizing it was a foolish question. He shook his head, affirming that he would apply. The sound of a blast of wind jolted Izuku from his thoughts, and he hoped All Might hadn't noticed his instinctual flinch. But it seemed he hadn't, as he was surrounded by steam. When the steam cleared, Izuku found himself face to face with a scrawny man whose face looked gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. The man's eyes darted around the dark underpass, searching for the All Might he had idolized. He found nothing. Yet, the man's bright blonde hair and dark 𝗟𝐬𝐬 with blue irises mirrored All Might's. Had he been affected by a quirk? But there was no one else around. The man sighed, a small trickle of blood escaping from the corner of his mouth. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, seemingly unfazed. Izuku stood in stunned silence, wondering what had happened to All Might's muscular form. Did he always have two forms, or was this a new development? Was it permanent or temporary? If he was bleeding, he likely had internal injuries. While that seemed like it should be temporary, he would have sought the best medical help available, so it didn't make sense for him to be bleeding so casually unless he had resigned himself to that fate. Izuku decided not to voice his concerns, anticipating that the hero would not answer his questions anyway. He waited for All Might to explain himself in a way he deemed appropriate for someone like him. All Might began to share his story, revealing an old, severe gash in his side, a reminder of a villain's attack from 5 years ago. He explained that he had undergone countless surgeries and had diminished because of them, now only able to perform hero work for about 3 hours a day. Izuku winced at the sight of the wound. He hesitated, recalling the implications of such a past. This fight had never been made public, and All Might asked him to keep it a secret. Izuku agreed, but he couldn't help but wonder why All Might had chosen to confide so much in him. All Might sighed, leaving Izuku with more questions than answers. Anyone who observed the scene would undoubtedly have questions, and they would likely express their curiosity online if an explanation wasn't provided. There was still a chance that Izuku might reveal his secret, but All Might trusted that he wouldn't. He gave Izuku a meaningful look, and Izuku nodded in agreement, assuring him that he would keep it confidential. All Might expressed his gratitude, checking his pockets where he had secured both bottles containing the villain. He began to move toward the tunnel's exit from which Izuku had originally come. Before All Might departed, Izuku briefly closed his eyes, then opened them again, a smile on his face that was smaller but still bright. He thanked All Might for everything and vowed to try his best to become a hero. The pro-hero turned to meet Izuku's gaze and wished him the best of luck. As All Might transformed back into his recognizable form, he leaped into the air with the aid of his quirk and vanished atop a nearby building. Izuku watched him go, filled with hope that he could indeed become a hero. The first thing Izuku did after All Might's departure was text his mother, who had left several missed calls and messages on his phone. After reassuring her that he was fine, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and started his journey home. He walked without concern for his injuries. His tongue still tingled, his throat felt raw, and his shoulder throbbed, but he pushed all discomfort aside. He doubted he would need to search for his 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐷 knife buried beneath his notebooks when he got home. Instead, he replayed All Might's parting words in his mind, wishing him the best of luck. All Might believed in his potential to become a hero, which gave Izuku a renewed sense of purpose. Although his quirk was often seen as villainous, he held on to the hope that it could be viewed differently, just as All Might had suggested. If he could gain admission to the prestigious hero school, 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐻's alma mater, and never misuse his peers' quirks, he might prove that he wasn't a villain. There was a chance he could fulfill his dream of becoming a hero instead of settling for a career as a quirk analyst. There wasn't much precedent for his unique quirk, which allowed him to absorb others' abilities. However, there was one hero, known to few but cherished by Izuku, who operated in the shadows, 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐻. While Izuku's quirk stole abilities, 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐻's quirk erased them. Though not the same, it was the closest resemblance he had found. They both took away quirks that did not belong to them, and while Izuku's was more controversial, he still felt a connection. This was why Izuku had a poster of 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐻 on the wall above his desk. He wished for a figurine to match, but 𝐼𝐻𝐻𝐻's underground status made that impossible. Izuku understood the longing to remain out of the spotlight, where mainstream pro-heroes faced constant attention from fans and the media. He had a chance, and he would hold on to that belief as he applied to you and approached its grand entrance for the entrance exam. After all, if All Might wished him luck and wanted him to succeed, who was he to defy those wishes? Izuku was determined to do his best to become a hero and would not stop until he achieved that goal. With newfound energy, Izuku made his way home, navigating through the suburb and avoiding pedestrians as he walked. The day was warm and sunny, and he shielded his eyes from the bright light whenever he looked up. He welcomed the warmth. Upon entering their apartment, his mother sprang up from the sofa where she had been resting. She rushed over in her slippers, concern etched on her face as she asked what had happened and why he was out so late. Izuku offered her an apologetic smile and explained that he had met All Might, who had encouraged him to pursue his dream of becoming a hero. For a moment, his mother stared at him, processing the information. When realization dawned, her expression softened, and she expressed her happiness for him. However, Izuku could sense a hint of worry in her voice, a concern he had come to recognize over the years. What did his peers think of him? He knew she also feared for his safety. She asked how he had encountered All Might, and Izuku, wanting to ease her worries, fabricated a story about seeing a villain and expecting a pro-hero to arrive. His mother frowned, reminding him that he had promised to avoid such situations. She circled around him, checking for injuries, but he had ensured that his clothes remained intact after the encounter. Izuku apologized, assuring her that it wouldn't happen again. She gave him a skeptical look, but he responded with an awkward smile. After promising to help with dinner later, he retreated to his bedroom, his mind still buzzing with thoughts of his future. He rummaged through his backpack until he found his homework, settled into the office chair at his desk, and adjusted his All Might figurine to sit beside his 𝐾𝐿 figurine instead of behind it. He opened his notebook to the first blank page and took a pencil from the wire cup to his right. His homework went quickly, aided by the comfort of his bedroom. Once he finished, he opened the top right drawer of his desk and retrieved Hero Analysis for the Future No. The cover was permanently bent upwards despite his efforts to store it upside down beneath stacks of other notebooks. The covers of the others were in a similar condition. Stalling for a moment, he flipped through the pages dedicated to All Might. Most of it consisted of breakdowns of All Might's battles that lasted longer than a single punch. He pressed the tip of the pencil against the top corner of the page and wrote, "Believes I can be a hero." He didn't need the reminder, but he felt compelled to write it. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to the first page of the journal. It featured a rough sketch of Izuku himself, with the bold words Quirk transfer at the top, the name he and his mother had given his quirk years ago. A bullet point beneath the title stated, "User can steal quirks." After he had written those words years ago, he had slammed the book shut and refused to touch it for 3 days. When he finally returned to the journal, it was only to begin an analysis of the viscosity hero, 𝐼𝐬. To the right of the words Quirk transfer, in the same spot where he had written on All Might's analysis page, Izuku wrote, "Can be a hero's quirk." When he looked away from the words, he added, another bullet point beneath the first, "Needs direct skin contact from both parties." He preferred the term both parties over user and victim. Izuku had never filled a page in a hero analysis journal with so little information. While he didn't mind keeping it that way, it wouldn't suffice. He needed to gather data, even if it was just the basics. If he couldn't manage that, how could he hope to be a hero? Standing up, he approached the door, hesitating for a moment. Then he turned the handle and made his way to the living area. His mother was on the sofa, watching the movie she often turned to when feeling stressed. She had been watching it before he arrived home, understandable given how late he was, but seeing her engrossed in it now made him uneasy. Izuku turned away from the TV. He placed his hands on the back of the sofa, ensuring she noticed his presence before she paused the movie. She looked up at him with an expectant smile, which faded when their eyes met. Concerned, she asked what was wrong. Izuku swallowed hard and expressed his longing to train his quirk, mentioning his intention to try for you again. He avoided looking directly at her face as he explained that he needed to know more about it. His mother offered to let him use her quirk, her voice gentle. She always said that, "Never take or steal." He hesitated, asking if that would be okay. She smiled with her eyes closed, a rare gesture that reminded him of Bakugo, who confidently believed Izuku would never take his quirk. Perhaps that was a kindness in its own way. Of course, she replied, patting the cushion beside her. She asked what he would like to try. Izuku explained that he was fairly certain it required direct skin contact, but he wasn't entirely sure. When she raised her arm, the sleeve of her sweater pushed up to her upper arm, and he placed his hand on her wrist. A slight unease washed over him at the contact. There was no indication that anything had happened, but he recalled that nothing had occurred during his previous attempts either. His mother focused on the coaster on the table, where a glass of water rested. She leaned forward, lifted the glass, and attempted to pull the coaster toward her. Nothing happened. Determined, he turned to the coffee table, palm down and fingers relaxed, pointing towards the TV remote and willing it to come to him. At first, it remained still, but he persisted, and eventually, it began to float into the air. When it hovered above his hand, he let his concentration waver. The remote fell, and he nearly dropped it when it hit his palm. After fumbling for a moment, he caught it and placed it back on the table. He informed his mother that he would return the remote and then see if it worked when he touched her sleeve instead. She nodded, expressing her trust in him. Izuku looked up from his hand, wiping away the tears that had formed in the corners of his eyes. He nodded a few more times than necessary. He placed his hand back on her wrist, willing her quirk to return to her. They exchanged object attraction back and forth, experimenting with what worked and what didn't. After satisfying his most pressing questions, he confirmed that it indeed required skin contact. He also discovered that it wasn't a 5-point quirk. He needed the entirety of his palm as well as his fingertips. He learned that his quirk would also function if he only touched someone's hair. It made sense, as both skin and hair contained a person's DNA, and a quirk was encoded in their genetic makeup. Therefore, it should work with mutant-type or transformation-type quirks that altered a person's skin. As he returned object attraction for the final time, Izuku mentioned that he was considering applying to 𝐒𝐮𝐬 and a few other hero schools. He explained that he wanted to apply to schools with both hero and general programs since he didn't think he could take the hero course entrance exams. He also intended to apply to schools that specialized in hero aid-related jobs. His mother didn't ask for further explanation. She seemed to understand why he couldn't, or wouldn't, take any hero entrance exam. His reasoning was simple. Hero entrance exams required quirks. Therefore, to compete, he would need to use his own. How could he jeopardize his fellow contestants' chances of a future at 𝐒𝐮𝐬? His mother smiled and encouraged him, reminding him that he didn't truly want to be just an analyst, so he should apply to several hero schools. With tears welling in his eyes, Izuku nodded in agreement. As the date of 𝐒𝐮𝐬's entrance exam approached, his first of 6, he dedicated himself to studying for the written tests. He immersed himself in every subject he anticipated would be included, plus anything else he thought might appear. However, he realized that studying alone wouldn't enhance his quirk, and he had already trained it as much as possible. The only area left for improvement was his physical fitness. He had paused his physical training for a while, but he had never truly pushed himself to achieve significant results. Eventually, as he began to question his top-choice high schools, his journals became his primary focus, taking precedence over workouts. While analysis was beneficial in its own right, it was not the only skill required for Japan's leading hero school. For the 10 months leading up to the exam, he ran every morning and night in the park next to his junior high school. With the Christmas money he had saved for hero merchandise, he purchased 2 adjustable dumbbells. Using those and a workout routine he devised after extensive research, he trained as much as he could without risking injury. In class, he often sat at the edge of his chair, trembling with anticipation until he could no longer maintain his balance. At home, he lifted weights until his arms felt numb, followed by squats until he could push no further. By the time the entrance exams arrived, his daily runs had doubled in length and nearly halved in time. The dumbbells felt surprisingly light, even at their heaviest. As Izuku approached the hill on the brick path leading to 𝐒𝐮𝐬's main building, he took a deep breath. Students his age bustled around him, showcasing a variety of appearances, from a boy with a lion's head to a girl with bubblegum pink hair that tripped her up. While they were intriguing to observe from a distance, he knew he would have to interact with them. Despite his attempts to mentally prepare, the nervous energy coursed through him. Most of the crowd was gathered around 2 boards, which he assumed displayed the room numbers for the written exams. Others were either walking alongside him or entering the building, while a few engaged in conversation. Those conversing wore the same gakuren, suggesting they had decided to face the challenge of the country's top hero school together. This realization prompted him to glance around for his own junior high uniform, and he felt a wave of relief at not spotting it. Navigating through the throng of students, Izuku made his way to the board on the right, where a slightly smaller crowd had gathered. He tightened his grip on the straps of his backpack, which he carried more for comfort than necessity. Although he only needed a few pencils, the backpack provided something to hold on to, easing the tension in his muscles. It also contained his 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐷 knife, tucked away in a small pocket, just in case. As he approached the group, he hesitated, searching for a spot to see the board without crowding anyone. However, Deku was nowhere to be found, nor was anyone else in a uniform like his. No one there knew what his quirk was, so there was no reason to avoid them. Yet, as he stepped closer, he stumbled over his own feet. Just before he could fall, he felt a sudden stop. In an instant, his feet lost contact with the ground. He scrambled to regain his balance, but instead he found himself floating slightly above the brick path. To his left stood a girl with a sheepish smile. She had light brown hair framing her round face and pink patches on her cheeks, giving her a permanently blushing appearance. Each fingertip was colored the same pink, a sign of a 5-point quirk that allowed her to manipulate gravity. She explained that she had used her quirk to stop him from falling, apologizing for not asking first but hoping he wouldn't mind her catching him. Although he appreciated her help, he felt uneasy as she placed her hands on his arms to guide him back to his feet before releasing her quirk. He managed to express his gratitude, albeit awkwardly. The girl smiled, her eyes closed, and Izuku briefly wondered how she would react if she knew his quirk. She remarked on how nerve-wracking the situation was, to which he agreed, feeling a mix of anxiety and excitement. As she wished him luck and turned to head toward the other board, he called out a soft response, hoping she heard him, though he doubted it. Feeling a twinge of guilt, he shook his head and approached the right board. The crowd had thinned enough for him to see the room numbers and last names without bumping into anyone. The rooms were organized by last name and the type of exam being administered, meaning he would be in a room with others applying for general studies, while the next room would host potential hero course students. He memorized his room number, repeating it in his mind as he stepped away from the gathering, feeling a sense of relief. However, his heart raced as he walked through the grand front doors of the main building. Guided by a sign in the middle of the walkway, he turned right, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. The hallway was just as impressive as he had imagined, wide enough to have a dotted line down the center, reminiscent of a multi-lane street. Classroom doors lined the left side, towering above him, while the right side consisted of floor-to-ceiling windows that unfortunately could not be opened. The only exit he felt confident about was the main entrance behind him, should he need it. Izuku was trying to be considerate of his fellow students with unique quirks, but the doors were oddly narrow, which seemed counterproductive. They were also tall enough that he had to tilt his head back to read the small sign displaying the room number. He was short for his age, but even someone as tall as 𝐼𝐻 would have to adjust their posture to see it. The first floor was designated for first-year classrooms, as indicated by the bold red 1F on the blue sign above one door and 1E above another at the end of the hallway. As he reached the end of the hallway, he turned, making sure to stay to the left of the dotted line. Although he noticed the hallway would turn left again, Izuku didn't need to take another turn. Just before the corner was Class 1's classroom, identifiable by the blocky 1A painted on the door. It was the only door with its label painted, which made Izuku think that the school was openly acknowledging its favoritism. His exam room, Class 1D, was the second door on his left, following what he assumed was a janitor's closet. The door was open, and from his angle, he could see the hunting dog hero, Hound Dog, sitting at the front desk. He wore his hero costume, complete with a muzzle that allowed him to speak. Although Izuku knew he would be too nervous to engage in conversation with Hound Dog about anything beyond the exam, it was still thrilling to see a pro hero up close. As he walked, he glanced at the other classroom doors down the hallway. He caught a glimpse of the girl who had saved him as she entered Class 1A. If he remembered correctly, that was one of the rooms designated for the written portion of the hero course exam. His gaze moved to Class 1B and then to Class 1C. He recalled that Class 1C was another room for the hero course examinees, but the door was closed, and a crowd of about a dozen students loitered outside, clearly waiting to be let in. It seemed like an unusual time for a proctor to be late. A deep, raspy yet distinctly feminine voice asked if this was a general studies room for taking the exam. Izuku paused, unsure if she was addressing him. He recognized her piercing brown eyes framed by black markings, which suggested a mutant-type wolf Quirk. It took him a moment to place her as the girl who had been waiting with the group outside Class 1C, leaning against the wall instead of mingling. One blue-gray furry ear on her head twitched as she awaited his response. He managed to reply that it was indeed a general studies room. She questioned the purpose of attending U for general studies, suggesting it was a bit extravagant to enroll in the country's top hero school just for that. Izuku took a moment to gather his thoughts before explaining that just because U was renowned for its hero course didn't mean its general studies or other courses weren't valuable. He believed that for some students, the goal was to eventually transfer into the hero course, but they had to start in general studies due to the practical exam requirements. Curious, she asked if that was his intention, to which he nodded cautiously. She inquired about his quirk, and he hesitated, feeling a wince rise within him. He explained that it wasn't a physical quirk and suggested that keeping it a secret might be beneficial for the upcoming sports festival. His voice lacked the confidence he had hoped for, but it was plausible enough to deter her from pressing further. She teased him about trying to gain an advantage later, and he responded that it implied he would be accepted. When she asked if he was planning to get in, he affirmed that he was, but acknowledged the complexity of the situation. Before he could respond further, a familiar figure caught his attention. With hunched shoulders and hands tucked into the pockets of his all-black outfit, the man looked oddly familiar. Izuku narrowed his eyes, trying to recall where he had seen those bloodshot, tired eyes before. It dawned on him that it was 𝐒𝐻𝐵. He must be the proctor for Class 1 CS exam. As he brushed past the group of students gathered at the door, his merciless glare made them part without hesitation. For a moment, Izuku wished he was in Class 1C, but he quickly dismissed the thought, realizing he wouldn't be able to concentrate on his exam with his favorite hero so close. The girl remarked that 𝐒𝐻𝐵 didn't seem to be in a hurry, and Izuku focused back on her, noting that at least he had arrived. She made a face, indicating her mixed feelings about the situation. Seizing the opportunity to leave, Izuku mentioned that he should probably get going and wished her luck on her exam. She returned the sentiment, and he offered her a parting smile before glancing one last time at 𝐒𝐻𝐵, who was now seated behind the desk in the classroom, before hurrying to his own room. If 𝐒𝐻𝐵 was a proctor for Class 1 CS exam, it was clear he was a teacher at U. The question lingered in Izuku's mind about which course and class he taught. As an underground hero, Izuku couldn't picture him as a teacher in the hero course, but he acknowledged that some hero course students might become underground heroes, making him a unique presence among the faculty. Regardless, Izuku knew he needed to focus on his exam. If he failed, he would have to let go of his dream school. This was his one chance, and he had to make it count. He would think about 𝐒𝐻𝐵 later. With newfound determination, he walked through the door and looked to Hound Dog for guidance. After providing his name, Hound Dog directed him to a seat in the back corner of the room, the farthest from the exit. While not ideal, it allowed him to survey the entire classroom easily. The clock indicated they had 22 minutes before the exam began, and Izuku realized he hadn't brought any study materials. He knew it wouldn't help much, as he struggled to concentrate with others around, except for his mother. He decided to examine the classroom, taking in the large chalkboard on the opposite wall behind Hound Dog and the 4 columns of 5 seats each that his classmates occupied. Most of his fellow students had already arrived, leaving only 4 seats unoccupied. He glanced at each student in the room, careful not to linger too long for fear of being noticed. Overall, the room was quite plain, but it had an atmosphere entirely different from his junior high school, which felt both refreshing and unsettling. When hound dogs stood up to distribute their exams, instructing them not to cheat or use a pen, Izuku pressed 2 fingers to his throat, his heart racing. Then the bell rang, and everyone flipped to the first page of the exam. Izuku followed suit, staring at the first question with confusion, even after reading it 3 times. Swallowing hard, he tried again, grasping only a basic idea of the question without any specifics. Glancing at the clock and realizing 3 minutes had already passed, Izuku gritted his teeth. Discreetly, he pressed his fingernails into the skin of his wrist, applying as much pressure as he could. When he finally released, he noticed dark crescent marks left behind. Turning his arm over to hide it, he took a deep, steadying breath and tried to read the first question once more. When his eyes landed on the particle at the end of the question, a small smile formed on his lips. Not only did he understand what it was asking, but the answer also came to him immediately. He felt a sense of relief. Although he typically struggled with tests due to his inability to concentrate, his month of studying had paid off. While he ran out of time as usual, leaving the last few questions as rushed guesses, he managed to focus enough to answer most to the best of his ability. A few questions remained unanswered, but he left the room feeling he had performed better than he had in a long time. Hopefully, that would be enough. It took Izuku 15 minutes to gather the courage to open 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐬𝐴's letter. When he finally found the bravery, he tore the envelope open with trembling hands, ripping it into pieces due to his lack of skill in opening envelopes. He nearly jumped when a small device fell to the floor and bounced under his chair. He frowned as he inspected it, realizing it was a holographic screen projector. It seemed like an extravagant expense, but 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 appeared to have questionable priorities. He placed the device on the table and turned it on. It flickered to life, revealing 𝐼𝐼𝐻𝐷's beaming face. With his signature smile, he introduced himself as 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐬's newest teacher. So the rumors had been true. 𝐼𝐼𝐻𝐷 informed him that out of 100 points, he scored 89 on the General Studies written exam. While it wasn't the highest score, it certainly wasn't the lowest. Izuku stared at the screen, his heart fluttering as he tried not to hope until he heard the final verdict. Due to his score, he would be joining 19 other students in Class 1C. He had been accepted. Overwhelmed with emotion, Izuku couldn't help but cry, grinning all the while. When his mother peeked through the door, waiting to hear the news, he flashed her the brightest smile he had given anyone in a long time. She blinked, her eyes softening, and soon they were both in tears together. As Izuku approached the hill beyond 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐻𝐷's entrance gate once more, he felt the urge to turn back and never return. But this was his opportunity, and it was what he wanted. He dug his fingernails into his sweaty palms and continued walking. Eventually, he placed his left hand on his backpack strap and tucked his right hand into his pocket to keep it from swinging awkwardly by his side. After nearly tripping on the walkway again, he walked through the open front doors of the building. He wondered if the doors would be open every morning, as it seemed unlikely a single student could open them. Even a crowd of students working together would likely struggle, especially without any strength-enhancing quirks. Izuku had his schedule in his pocket just in case, but he had already memorized it in preparation, preferring not to take his eyes off his surroundings. Turning right and then left, he passed a few students loitering in the halls. There were far fewer than he had expected when he had envisioned the school a month earlier. However, he had only seen one hallway so far and had no idea where the cafeteria was, hoping to follow a crowd when the lunch bell rang, as he would need to eat to maintain his health. To his relief, the classroom door was open. He was glad not to make a fool of himself trying to open it while other students were present. Behind the desk in the front of the room, which was laid out like Class 1D's classroom, was ectoplasm. He ranked number 7 on the top 10 most villainous-looking heroes list, earning that title due to his quirk giving him a threatening appearance. With no lips, his teeth were fully visible, and his gums appeared to have sunken into his face, combined with his lanky figure and sharp eyes, making him one of the less approachable pro-heroes in the country. As Izuku entered the room, the pro-hero greeted him by name, and he stuttered a response. He wondered if he would be able to concentrate on the material in his classes, especially with a pro teaching them. It seemed he had frozen just beyond the doorway, as a moment later, someone approached him from behind. Hopping out of the way, Izuku apologized profusely. The boy's hair sparkled like snow in the morning sunlight, sharing the same color. Unlike Izuku, whose dark freckles spread across his nose to the outer corners of his eyes, this boy had white flecks clustered only under the inner corners. Perhaps he had an ice or snow-related quirk. Izuku moved to the back of the room, weaving around the desks to avoid getting too close to anyone as he passed by. Since ectoplasm hadn't assigned specific seats, Izuku assumed they were free to choose. The seats closest to the exit were already occupied, leaving only one in the last row. He hurried to claim it, even though it was far from the door, with 2 lines of desks on his right and 1 on his left. Nobody knew what his quirk was, at least not yet. He hoped they wouldn't find out until the sports festival. As he settled at his desk, he glanced around the room, wondering if any of his classmates would like him. If they asked about his quirk, a question as common as asking for someone's name, would he answer or dodge it? He tugged at his tie, which he had tied in a rush that morning. His leg bounced under the desk, and he felt grateful to have chosen a seat in the back, hoping to minimize irritation among his classmates. He wished they wouldn't notice him, even if they were sitting right next to him. It felt wrong to try to make friends, knowing they would eventually discover his quirk. He didn't want to trick them into liking him, especially if his personality alone might deter them first. A minute later, another student entered the room, hands in his pockets and eyes drooping as if he hadn't slept well in days. The bruises under his eyes were prominent, and his purple hair seemed to defy gravity, sticking up in every direction. He scanned the room and settled into the seat near the side, resting his head on his desk and closing his eyes. Among the classmates, he appeared to be the least approachable. Soon after, 3 more students wandered in. Ectoplasm introduced himself as the duplication hero and their homeroom teacher for the year. He promised not to bore them with a lengthy speech and informed them that the day would mostly consist of meeting their teachers and getting accustomed to their surroundings. However, first, they had an entrance ceremony to attend. As Ectoplasm made his way to the door, Izuku's new classmates exchanged glances and followed him. Izuku hung back, knowing he couldn't be the first to exit, so he settled for being last. The purple-haired boy raised his head as their classmates passed, one eye open to observe them. Only after everyone had gone by, including a reluctant Izuku, did he move toward the door. The group followed Ectoplasm through the winding halls of the building, chatting among themselves. Izuku paid close attention to every turn they made and every sign above a door, determined to remember the layout to avoid getting lost in the future. He didn't want to give anyone another reason to mock him. Upon reaching the auditorium, Izuku felt overwhelmed by its size. It was separate from the main building and featured multiple exits at the back and 2 beside the wooden stage, which were designated as emergency exits. His class formed a line, and Izuku tried to fall back so that the purple-haired boy would take the spot in front of him, but the boy shot him a glare. With that, Izuku scrambled to the next open seat in the row, unfortunately wedged between 2 classmates with only a thin armrest separating them. He planted his hands in his lap, keeping them rigid. He searched for familiar faces, hoping to see Nice Girl and Wolf Girl among the 2 hero course homerooms, but he couldn't spot them or Bakugo. Izuku knew Bakugo had been offered a spot in Class 1A, as his mother had shared the good news with him. Class 1C seemed to be the last to arrive. The voice hero, Present Mike, took the stage a moment later, announcing that everyone was present, which meant the hero courses were not coming. He wondered if they had a separate orientation or if they were skipping it since it was only relevant for the other courses. The entrance ceremony began similarly to any other schools, lasting about an hour. Most of that time was taken up by their principal, a bipedal mouse who introduced himself as Principal Nizu. He wished everyone the best of luck for the year in a rather roundabout way. When he concluded his final anecdote, the teachers were introduced. It was unusual for an entrance ceremony, but since each teacher was a pro hero, it seemed fitting. With each introduction, Izuku felt the urge to record the differences and similarities between the pros' attitudes toward the press and a group of students, but he hadn't brought his hero analysis journal with him. They didn't introduce any hero course teachers, leading Izuku to wonder if 𝐼𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐸 taught only first-year hero course students or if he also taught second or third-year classes. After Principal 𝐒𝐮𝐬 stated they had no time to waste with ceremonies, despite being the one who had taken so long, he released the classes 2 at a time. When their turn came, Izuku focused on the path back to their classroom, confident he would be able to navigate to the auditorium on his own. The rest of the morning classes passed more quickly than Izuku had expected. In each class, the teachers introduced themselves and outlined what they would cover throughout the year. When the bell rang to signal the start of lunch, ectoplasm directed the class to the cafeteria, suggesting they use the time to get to know one another. With his heart racing, Izuku followed the crowd. He wondered if he would have to find someone to sit with or if there would be an empty table for him. Did he want to sit alone and draw negative attention to himself? As tempting as it was to skip lunch, he knew he needed to eat. Depriving himself of food before training after school wouldn't be wise, and his mother was too observant for him to get away with making his own lunches. Unfortunately, he had to break his habit of skipping lunch and disappearing until the bell rang. The cafeteria was unlike anything he had ever seen, even larger than the auditorium they had been in earlier. The number of students crowding into the lunch line and around the numerous tables arranged in neat rows suggested that all the courses and years ate together at the same time. Still, he couldn't imagine there would be extra places to sit. He had already lost sight of his classmates in the crowd, having been too busy trying to avoid running into anyone in the hallways. So, he took his place in line without recognizing anyone beside him, keeping to himself and stepping slightly aside to avoid being pressed against anyone. After a short wait, which was not as long as he had anticipated, he walked away with a steaming bowl of katsudon. If he was going to sit with a group of his peers at a lunch table for the first time in 7 years, he thought that eating his favorite food might help ease the situation. He searched for nice girl or wolf girl, but once again, they were nowhere to be found. He hoped they had made it into the hero course and were just lost in the crowd. As he looked for anyone else he recognized, his eyes landed on a distinctive head of hair. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 was sitting surrounded by students who looked like second or third years, but the seat across from him was open. Briefly, he considered heading elsewhere, but every nearby table was already filled. The longer he stood out in the open surrounded by such a large crowd, the more uncomfortable he felt. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he took the empty seat. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 looked up at the sound of the tray hitting the table, staring blankly as if silently demanding an explanation. Izuku felt a rush of nerves as he stumbled over his words, apologizing for the intrusion and explaining that there were no other seats available. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 gruffly stated that he was not there to make friends. This surprised Izuku, but he thought it might work in his favor. If they could agree to sit next to each other without much interaction, it could be a comfortable arrangement. When Izuku expressed his own longing to become a hero, 𝗟𝗶𝐸 raised his head, showing a flicker of interest despite maintaining a neutral expression. Encouraged, Izuku continued, sharing that he had not taken the hero course's exam because he knew his quirk would not perform well in the practical portion. He asked if 𝗟𝗶𝐸 had taken both the hero course and general studies exams. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 confirmed that he had taken both. Curious, Izuku inquired about 𝗟𝗶𝐸's exam results, but immediately regretted his question. He quickly clarified that he meant no offense, trying to explain his reasoning. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 responded that he had not received any points because his quirk was brainwashing, which meant points went to those he had influenced. The revelation caught Izuku off guard, and 𝗟𝗶𝐸 added with a half-smirk that it was considered villainous. Izuku, intrigued, asked if that was what people called his quirk. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 did not respond, but Izuku could sense the answer was clear. He then asked how the quirk worked, hoping to learn more. 𝗟𝗶𝐸 explained that he could control anyone who responded to his questions with simple commands, and it only activated when he wanted it to. Izuku fiddled with his chopsticks, trying to gather his thoughts. He believed that 𝗟𝗶𝐸's quirk could be advantageous for a hero. He suggested that he could command villains to surrender, acknowledging that there were potential drawbacks but also ways to navigate them. He proposed the idea of becoming an underground hero, where his identity and quirk could remain relatively unknown. He reassured 𝗟𝗶𝐸 that even if rumors spread, many heroes, like 𝐼𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐸, went unrecognized. Before Izuku could apologize again for rambling, Purple Boy asked if he truly believed that. Izuku hesitated, not wanting to reveal too much about his own quirk, which was even more villainous than brainwashing. However, he sensed that Purple Boy had never been told his quirk could be heroic before, and he wanted to change that. With a soft smile, he affirmed that people often doubted him because of his quirk, encouraging Purple Boy to see the potential in himself. Purple Boy nodded slowly, reflecting on the nature of his quirk. It was the application of brainwashing that determined its morality, not its existence. While deemed villainous for its potential misuse, it could also serve heroic purposes in the right hands. To subdue villains, he would need to temporarily override their free will, a tactic every hero employed in some form. However, he questioned whether it was fair to manipulate other examinees into scoring points for him. Ultimately, the points had gone to them, but his intentions had been to take a step toward his dream. He wondered what right Izuku had to judge his actions. After all, many would have tried to hinder their competitors, and his quirk had compelled him to do so. Though Purple Boy's quirk appeared villainous, it could only be deemed so in specific contexts that did not apply to him. Everyone had been undermining each other by destroying robots that others could have fought. Thus, a distinction existed between Purple Boy's abilities and Izuku's. Whenever Izuku used his quirk, it inflicted harm, which set them apart. Purple Boy studied him for a moment before inquiring about Izuku's quirk. Izuku hesitated, fidgeting with his fingers, and described it as somewhat ineffective. Purple Boy pressed him, questioning how a hero could have a useless quirk. Izuku chuckled nervously, acknowledging that it wasn't the best response. He took a deep breath and explained that he called it quirk transfer, allowing him to take on the quirk of anyone he touched. When Izuku glanced up to gauge Purple Boy's reaction, he was surprised to find no sign of disgust or fear, only a hint of understanding. Purple Boy acknowledged the power of Izuku's ability, prompting Izuku to reflect on its potential for villainy. Purple Boy countered that he hadn't considered Izuku's quirk to be villainous. Izuku explained that he refrained from using his quirk during the hero exam to ensure fairness for the other examinees. Purple Boy regarded him with slight irritation, perhaps questioning whether Izuku believed his choice to avoid using his quirk was unfair. Izuku understood that Purple Boy had limited options, but before he could express this, Purple Boy asked about his longing to be a hero. Izuku affirmed his aspiration, puzzled by the question. He felt that his decision to forego the exam demonstrated his dedication, as he refused to use his quirk to harm others. He expressed his wish to prove he wasn't a villain, to be someone others could rely on and trust for protection, even with his quirk. Purple Boy simply hummed in response. Izuku leaned in, curious about Purple Boy's motivations for wanting to be a hero. Purple Boy remarked that one cannot control what their heart desires, prompting a warm smile from Izuku, who found it to be a wonderful reason. Purple Boy introduced himself as Hitoshi Shinso, and Izuku reciprocated with his name. The bell rang soon after, and they returned to their homeroom in a comfortable silence, which was perhaps a generous description. Shinso was not much of a talker, so Izuku allowed the quiet to persist. They made their way back to class independently, which relieved Izuku. The first class after lunch was Quirk Studies, followed by Physical Education. During the fitness tests, Izuku was pleased to see significant improvements in his results since junior high, except for the sitting toe touch, which indicated he needed to stretch more in his training. As the day concluded, Izuku began packing his notes with 5 minutes remaining. He noticed Shinso doing the same. He wondered if Shinso also preferred to leave early to avoid being caught by others. Shinso had faced similar treatment to Izuku, but he appeared more bored than anxious. When ectoplasm dismissed the class, Izuku lingered at the back while Shinso did the same, both ready to leave. Once the classroom cleared, Shinso surprised Izuku by waiting for him. Unlike Bakugo, Shinso did not have an intimidating look, so Izuku approached him cautiously. Shinso proposed they train together after school. Izuku was taken aback, questioning why Shinso would want to train with him. Shinso's expression suggested it was obvious, prompting Izuku to clarify his thoughts. They agreed to meet at a nearby park for sparring, which Izuku found to be a practical idea since they might face situations where they couldn't use their quirks. 𝗟𝗏 stated they would start the next day, and Izuku expressed gratitude for the offer, though he felt awkward about it. 𝗟𝗏 walked ahead, and after a moment of hesitation, Izuku decided to let him go home alone, avoiding any further awkwardness. As 𝗟𝗏 walked away, Izuku began his journey home as well. With the sports festival approaching, both he and 𝗟𝗏 were preparing in the best way they knew, through sparring. They headed to their favorite training site, and as they turned into the hallway, Izuku waved at 𝗟𝗏 when their eyes met. On the final day of their first week at 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐸, Izuku and 𝐂𝐮𝐬 𝐃𝐞𝐭𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐬, known as Wolf Girl, unexpectedly crossed paths. While 𝗟𝗏 had congratulated Izuku on his acceptance into Class 1A, 𝗃𝐞𝐭𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐬 playfully teased him about it, boasting about her own position in Class 1B. Izuku listened attentively until Bakugo appeared down the hallway. Spotting him, Izuku quickly made an excuse and hurried off to catch up with 𝗟𝗏, who had moved ahead as soon as Izuku paused to chat. 𝗟𝗏 and Izuku had established a routine of sparring 3 times a week, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, for the past month. However, at Izuku's suggestion, they decided to intensify their training to 5 days a week for the 2 weeks leading up to the festival, allowing themselves 2 days off just before the event. Now, with only a week remaining before the festival, they found themselves training in the park nearest to 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐻's campus. The park was bustling with activity, with most people congregating on the central lawn. Families spread out on towels under the warm spring sun, tossing frisbees and footballs, while others played with their dogs. A wide sidewalk encircled the lawn, lined with vendors enticing passers-by with popsicles and taiyaki. 𝗟𝗏 and Izuku had learned to steer clear of the vendors on their way to their training spot, though they occasionally indulged in a snack on their way home. On the north side of the park, they discovered their ideal training area, a secluded patch of grass hidden behind a cluster of tall trees that occasionally dropped pine cones onto the ground. Although it was not as small as Izuku had imagined, the area was rarely used by others, likely due to the unforgiving pine cones scattered around. Izuku had learned this lesson the hard way, and 𝗟𝗏 had shared a laugh at his expense, only to find himself in the same predicament the following week. Now, he made it a habit to kick any pine cone he encountered, and Izuku couldn't help but smile at the sight. As 𝗟𝗏 initiated their second sparring match of the day with a roundhouse kick, Izuku noted his improvement. 𝗟𝗏's kicks had become both higher and faster. When 𝗟𝗏 ducked under Izuku's jab and countered with a punch, Izuku admired the speed with which he retracted his fist. 𝗟𝗏 had quickly learned that lingering after a punch could lead to being thrown over Izuku's shoulder, but it had taken him some time to adapt. Izuku, eager to try new throws he had seen in martial arts videos, seized every opportunity to practice. However, his attempts to grab 𝗟𝗏's arm often ended in failure. Izuku had always been good at holding back his punches, but his biggest challenge lay in dodging attacks. He had developed a knack for predicting 𝗟𝗏's movements, quickly discerning whether a punch, hook, uppercut, or kick was coming based on 𝗟𝗏's weight shifts. Yet, despite his ability to anticipate the attacks, Izuku's body would often freeze when faced with an incoming blow. When 𝗟𝗏 did land a hit, it was solid and impactful, showcasing his strength and form. This tendency of Izuku's had left him with more bruises than he cared to count, while 𝗟𝗏 learned to temper his strikes. Initially, Izuku had only improved his ability to counter kicks, finding it easier to catch them. He would close the distance before 𝗟𝗏 could fully unleash his power. Over time, however, Izuku began to walk home with fewer aches and pains. He learned to evade 𝗟𝗏's punches, allowing them to graze his cheek instead. It was a small compromise, but it worked for him, and he adapted his movements to minimize the impact. Still, there were moments when he took a hit full force, particularly when he froze in anticipation of a familiar attack. In one of their sparring sessions, Izuku pushed forward, gripping the back of 𝗟𝗏's neck and driving his knee into his chest, a calculated move to knock the wind out of him. Against a different opponent, it could have been a more damaging strike, but in this case, it was effective. With 𝗟𝗏 momentarily winded, Izuku swept his legs and pushed him gently to the ground. Izuku watched as 𝗟𝗏 groaned and sat up, a hint of mischief in his expression. 𝗟𝗏 seemed pleased with himself, flashing a confident grin. Izuku felt a sense of unfairness at the turn of events, but he quickly got to his feet. 𝗟𝐿 had stopped offering a hand to help him up ever since Izuku had awkwardly suggested it was unnecessary during their first week of sparring. Although Izuku's face had revealed his true feelings, 𝗟𝐿 had respected his boundaries without asking for an explanation. Instead, he had shared his own discomfort with being touched, which, while not achieving its intended effect, was appreciated by Izuku. 𝗟𝐿 inquired if Izuku wanted to go another round, and he nodded in agreement. They created some distance between each other, raising their fists in preparation. 𝗟𝐿 hesitated, then asked if Izuku had any idea about the upcoming festival and its events. Izuku asked for clarification on the 3 events, but 𝗟𝐿 didn't take the opportunity to correct him. Instead, he lunged forward, pulling back his arms slightly, a habit he had yet to break despite Izuku's suggestions. Izuku moved to the side and reflected on the upcoming sports festival. The 3rd round would always be a one-on-one match, but he hadn't had the chance to review the last decade's events to predict the first 2 rounds. Mr. Terumi assigned so much homework that it was hard to find the time. 𝗟𝐿 attempted a left hook, but Izuku ducked under it and landed a jab to 𝗟𝐿's shoulder. Breathing heavily, Izuku struggled to articulate his thoughts, realizing that 𝗟𝐿's few words at a time might have been a strategy. As Izuku continued, he mentioned his inability to refrain from writing everything he thought about. 𝗟𝐿, with an eye roll, questioned how anyone could write only the bare minimum on such an interesting topic as Quirk studies. The conversation shifted to the potential return of the villains from the 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐻 attack. Izuku kicked 𝗟𝐿's sternum, sending him stumbling backward, and they both took a moment to catch their breath. Izuku expressed doubt that the villains would show up, reasoning that while it would be impactful if they managed to breach security, the extensive measures 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐻 had implemented to ensure safety made it unlikely. The villains had previously attacked during 𝐼𝐼𝐻𝐽's training, and it didn't seem logical for them to attempt a rematch with so many pro-heroes present. However, Izuku acknowledged the possibility that the villains might return. He voiced his concerns about someone having access to 𝐒𝐮𝐻's private information, suggesting the presence of a mole. He recalled the terrifying details of the 𝐒𝐮𝐻 attack, including the monstrous Nomu that had posed a significant challenge to 𝐼𝐼𝐻. Although 𝐼𝐼𝐻 had ultimately triumphed, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had taken a toll on him. Noticing 𝗟𝐿's expression, Izuku approached him, questioning whether he had been stalling for time. Concerned about 𝗟𝐿's lack of sleep, he suggested they take a break. Sitting down in the grass, he felt the blades poking through his uniform as he waited for 𝗟𝐿 to join him. 𝗟𝐿 admitted to getting only 2 or 3 hours of sleep, revealing his struggle with insomnia. Despite being able to fall asleep easily, he often woke up due to his restless mind. He had tried various remedies, but nothing seemed to work, leading him to rely on iced coffee to get through the day. Izuku insisted that they should call it a day and take a break, understanding that one day off wouldn't be detrimental. 𝗟𝐿 yawned, showing signs of fatigue as he rested his chin on his palm. They remained in silence, enjoying the cool breeze that rustled the trees around them. After a while, 𝗟𝐿 stood up and checked to see if Izuku would follow. The look he gave was far less intimidating than Bakugo's usual glares, and Izuku felt comfortable walking alongside him. As they descended the slight incline of the park, keeping a distance from the vendors, Izuku inquired about 𝗟𝐿's plans for the sports festival and how he would manage to get enough rest. 𝗟𝐿 simply replied that he would pray. Izuku recalled how asking Recovery Girl to heal his aches had been one of his best decisions lately, as it had allowed him to fall into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. Izuku often found himself waking up during the night, startled by even the slightest sounds, whether it was his mother quietly moving to the bathroom or the distant hoot of an owl outside his window. To combat this, he had started listening to ambient music an hour before bedtime, hoping it would help him adjust and drown out the noises that usually disrupted his sleep. It worked sometimes, but not always. However, the night before, he had been so exhausted that he fell asleep without starting his playlist, and remarkably, he managed to sleep through the night. This achievement was noteworthy, and he considered utilizing Recovery Girl's quirk more often, as it was likely the reason for his restful night. Anticipating a stressful event the following day made it almost certain he wouldn't sleep well on a typical night. The reason he sought Recovery Girl's assistance was that the bruises he had sustained over the weeks had become too numerous to ignore. He and 𝐮𝐲 had made their way to the nurse's office, hoping to avoid entering the sports festival on the brink of exhaustion. He hoped her quirk had a similar positive effect on 𝐮𝐲's sleep as it had on his own. As he began to jog, maintaining a steady pace that wouldn't drain his energy, Izuku mentally reviewed his predictions for the day, hoping it would bring him some comfort. He had spent his evenings researching and watching footage of first-year sports festivals from the previous year to as far back as 2 decades. After noting the first 2 rounds for each year, he compared them. The third round was always a one-on-one match, and based on his observations, there was about an 80% chance it would be a straightforward Quirk versus Quirk battle. While not a foolproof statistic, it was sufficient for his planning. Izuku believed you would avoid reusing events from recent years, so he eliminated several possibilities right away. There was always a chance of a new event, but with limited space and equipment, options were restricted. His notes indicated that you wasn't opposed to revisiting older ideas, provided they were outdated enough. However, obstacle races appeared to be US's preferred choice for the first round, and since it hadn't been used in recent years, he strongly suspected it would be the opening event. It had consistently served as a qualifying round in past festivals. Realistically, Izuku had only a vague sense of what the day might entail, but researching always calmed him when faced with situations beyond his control. He picked up his speed slightly, feeling the morning breeze brush against his face, which eased his nerves a bit. His heart raced, partly due to the run. As he approached US's main building, he slowed to a brisk walk after entering through the gate. He followed the narrow brick path that wound around the left side of the building. Another left turn led him toward the first of 3 stadiums behind the school. Each stadium was flanked by food stalls, and he inhaled the enticing aroma of steaming takoyaki while observing a vendor placing skewered dango in a small display holder. He noticed no vendors creating smoke or melting sugar, so he held his breath as he passed by. The stalls were vibrant and colorful, each adorned with a unique color scheme that contrasted with those beside it. People of all ages and quirks mingled along the walkway. To avoid the worst of the crowd, Izuku navigated around the stalls. Although he felt the familiar urge to escape, he managed to smile politely at anyone who glanced his way. Dressed in his PE uniform, it was clear to everyone that he was a competitor, and he received more than his fair share of glances, which made him uneasy. Izuku slipped through a side entrance marked with a sign that read, "Participants Only." The hallway was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering in from both ends. He could still see well enough to locate the room designated for Class 1C, indicated by a piece of printer paper taped to the door. Before entering, he discreetly wiped his hands on the side of his breaths, hoping to dry the sweat accumulating on his palms. Inside the room, about a quarter of his class was already present. Since you required the general course to participate alongside the hero course, he would soon see the rest of his classmates. 2 square tables pushed together occupied half the room, with a few foldable chairs tucked under each side. Most students gathered in the back corner, which suited Izuku just fine, as it allowed him to take a seat near the only door. 𝐮𝐲 was not among the students in the room, which caused Izuku to frown. Once settled in his chair, Izuku retrieved his phone from his pocket and unlocked it. He opened the Photos app, scrolling through the last few dozen images, all taken the night before, each depicting a different analysis page from Hero Analysis for the Future number 13. He read through them slowly, allowing his scratchy handwriting to come into focus. He hadn't mustered the courage to bring the physical copy with him. He worried someone might notice it, ask about it, and laugh at him. Or worse, they might think he was taking notes on various quirks to determine which ones he could potentially acquire in the future. After all, he would soon reveal his own quirk. Izuku dug his fingernails into his arm beneath his sleeve until his nerves settled. Focusing on his phone, he squinted to decipher a particularly messy bullet point. He had included analysis pages for his peers, 𝐮𝐲, 𝗟𝗏, Kirano, and Todoroki, in the photos he took. Reviewing their quirks couldn't hurt, even if he felt he didn't really need to, as he tended to memorize information naturally. Most of the analysis regarding his classmates' quirks was unconfirmed, but he had a solid understanding of their abilities. The insights he had for 𝐮𝐬, 𝗟𝗏𝐻, and 𝗍𝗏 were based on what they had shared with him, while his analysis of Todoroki stemmed from online research. Being the son of the number 2 hero, there was no shortage of articles about him. Izuku made sure to include much more original content. The door creaked open, and when Izuku looked up, he met 𝐶𝐮𝐬's gaze. 𝗪𝐻 strolled in with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed as usual. The bags under his eyes seemed slightly lighter, which was a relief. Izuku placed his phone on the table, turning it off and setting it face down. 𝗪𝐻 pulled out the metal chair beside him and took a seat. He asked if Izuku had seen the stands. Izuku had intentionally avoided looking at the stands, knowing that the sight of thousands of spectators would only increase his anxiety. He groaned in response to 𝗪𝐻's reminder. 𝗪𝐻 chuckled softly. When asked about the first round, Izuku rested his chin on his hand. He admitted that he couldn't narrow it down well and guessed it might be an obstacle race, as you often favored those. 𝗪𝐻 nodded thoughtfully. Soon after, the rest of their class entered, clearly unhappy about being forced to participate. The intercom crackled to life moments later, with Present Mic's voice instructing them to head into the stadium. Without a word, 𝗪𝐻 stood up, and Izuku followed suit. As they stepped into the sunlight, the bright rays forced Izuku to squint. He blinked to adjust his vision, raising a hand to shield his eyes while walking with slightly shaky legs. The presence of a live audience felt overwhelming. Looking around, Izuku noticed 8 exits in the stadium, each leading to dark hallways similar to the one they had just exited. When he glanced up at the stands, he immediately regretted it. They were packed to the brim, nearly overflowing with spectators eager to watch the first years compete. The crowd buzzed with excitement. It made sense that the first-year stadium would be full. It was where citizens came to witness new talent and where pro heroes scouted for potential interns. The thought of so many people, including pro heroes, observing him sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. As a general studies student, he wasn't eligible for an internship with a pro, but they would still be watching to see if he could make it past the first round. A poor impression could lead to being overlooked in the future, especially if he ever transferred. He kept pace with 𝗪𝐻, who was glaring at their future competition ahead. On stage stood Midnight in her hero costume, holding a WHP. Present Mic was announcing the arrival of each class from a press box above them, with 𝒟𝗍𝐻 sitting beside him. The thought of 𝒟𝗍𝐻 watching made Izuku anxious. If he embarrassed himself, it would be hard to live it down. While Class 1A and Class 1B received enthusiastic introductions from Present Mic, the general studies classes were introduced by name only. 𝗪𝐻 scowled at this, and Izuku understood his frustration. Initially, the animosity toward the hero courses had surprised Izuku, but it was clear they had advantages, especially with All Might as their teacher. Many students resented the cancellation of 𝒟𝗏𝐻's public events due to the USJ incident, which was meant to protect them from villains. Izuku didn't mind the decision, but he wasn't a fan of large crowds, making him somewhat biased. Even though he sometimes found the school's favoritism irritating, he recognized that no school was perfect. Compared to his junior high, where he often came home injured from training, was far better, especially since no one knew what his quirk was. As they stopped at the back of the crowd, Midnight called for silence, allowing the audience to quiet down. She announced the student pledge would be led by Katsuki Bakugo, who had placed first in both the practical and written exams for the hero course. 𝗪𝐻 scowled as Bakugo made his way up the stairs to the stage. Izuku positioned himself behind 𝗪𝐻, hoping to remain unnoticed. Standing side by side, Izuku's height barely reached 𝗪𝐻's chin. Bakugo glared at the stands, hands in his pockets and posture hunched. He stepped up to the microphone, stating that he was going to win this. The crowd erupted in complaints, directing their disdain toward Class 1. Bakugo returned to his classmates, who quickly scolded him with exaggerated gestures. Midnight awkwardly announced the start of the first game, a qualifier where they would begin to feel the pressure. She held her WHP aloft, pointing it toward the screen that would display the name of the first round's event. The options spun rapidly before slowing down to reveal the obstacle race. 𝗟𝐿 raised his eyebrows, acknowledging Izuku's correct guess. Izuku grinned sheepishly, admitting he had done a lot of research. Before the crowd could murmur, Midnight continued, reminding everyone that using their quirks was not only allowed but encouraged, even for sabotaging fellow competitors, as long as no one was intentionally harmed. She emphasized that only the first 42 students to finish would advance to the second round, wishing them good luck. When Izuku speculated about the second round, he admitted he couldn't narrow it down much. It could be any number of things, perhaps a game of capture the flag like 6 years ago. 𝗟𝐿 acknowledged they would find out soon as the massive stone doors to the obstacle race began to slide open. Izuku suggested they try to get a spot near the front, though he felt a frown creeping in. Moving closer to the front seemed like the best strategy, but it also meant pushing through a crowd. The alternative, however, was far less appealing. The hallway behind the entrance appeared narrow, presenting a challenge in its own right. Izuku considered the situation, realizing that those caught in the crowd would struggle to escape. There was a possibility that someone, likely a hero course student, would attempt to take down the frontrunners. Perhaps they could secure a position near the front without being in the thick of it. 𝗟𝐿 nodded and moved ahead, prompting Izuku to follow him as he navigated through the crowd, striving to get as close to the front as possible. Izuku felt a tingling sensation on his skin as they made their way, not getting too far but still better than being stuck at the back. They exchanged a brief acknowledgement of their intentions, both understanding that relying on each other would not leave a strong impression. They needed to prove their worth for the hero course independently, so they decided to split up. In the sea of students, silence enveloped them, broken only by the sound of shuffling feet in anticipation, which made it hard to hear the buzzer counting down. When it finally rang out, the sound was more intense than Izuku had anticipated, causing him to flinch. In an instant, everyone surged forward, pushing into the throng in the hallway. 𝗟𝐿 and Izuku were quickly separated. Izuku pressed on, determined to pass the first round and, if possible, draw some positive attention to himself. However, using his quirk might complicate that goal. As he maneuvered through the crowd, Izuku spotted Todoroki, identifiable by his striking half-red, half-white hair, breaking away from the group and reaching the other side. Suddenly, Todoroki's right hand twitched, a clear signal before a wave of ice surged toward the students behind him. Those nearest to Todoroki found themselves ensnared in a thick layer of ice that climbed up their legs. As the ice spread, it lost some of its potency, merely coating the ground without freezing anyone in place. In front of Izuku, a girl slipped on the ice, losing her balance and pulling down the boy beside her. Izuku narrowly avoided joining them, steadying himself and carefully stepping over them, hoping they would be all right but knowing he couldn't afford to waste time. Finally, he broke free from the icy grip, sliding slightly before regaining his balance. Ahead, he saw the packed dirt path waiting for him. Right behind him, 𝗟𝐿 had cleverly manipulated 3 students into assisting him, a strategic move that, while perhaps a bit harsh, was effective. Behind 𝗟𝐿, a mass of students was so tightly packed that they could barely move, confirming their choice to separate had been wise. 42 students would advance to the next round, which meant Izuku needed to hurry. Without a quirk to aid him, he felt at a significant disadvantage from the start. The only quirk he could have taken before the festival was his mother's, but he couldn't justify taking it from her, even if it might have been useful. He could consider borrowing a quirk from another competitor, but he recalled the reasoning he had used to avoid the hero exam. The sports festival was indeed his best chance to make a name for himself and attract the attention of the hero course teachers. However, he was aware that many competitors, even among the hero course students, might not have quirks suited for an obstacle race. If he revealed his quirk too early and it drew negative attention, he would find himself at a disadvantage in the more critical rounds ahead. He would need to use his quirk eventually, but not yet. He believed he could qualify without it. Now on solid ground, he began to overtake the students around him when the ground suddenly trembled. Looking up, he saw the towering robots typically used for hero course training. They loomed nearly as high as the middle rows of the stands, creaking and groaning, leaving a ringing in Izuku's ears as they shifted. Their flat faces were adorned with red camera lenses that glimmered in the sunlight. Everyone halted at a safe distance, the crowd much thinner than at the entrance. Todoroki pressed forward, launching another wave of ice at the robots. In an instant, they were encased in heavy chunks of ice, immobilized. Before they could topple, Todoroki dashed beneath them, and Izuku followed suit, along with a few other students. The robots crashed down behind them, sending a rush of cold air and shards scattering in all directions. Above him, Izuku spotted Bakugo blasting over the robots, focusing solely on the lead. Thankfully, he seemed to disregard everyone else. Izuku hurried after Todoroki, who was leaving a trail of ice as he propelled himself forward. On the other side awaited a swarm of smaller robots, each marked with numbers indicating their point value. These were remnants from the hero course's entrance exam. The one-pointers were relatively small, and as one lunged at Izuku, he realized they were also slow. He easily ducked out of its path. Despite the heavy workload from his classes, Izuku had maintained a consistent training routine. To manage his studies, he had reduced his runs to just one in the evening, but he had still built up impressive endurance since his junior high days. He could feel his heart racing, and despite the exertion, he felt good. Scattered on the ground were a few intact pieces of the Zero-Pointer's armor. Although there was a slight chance they could be useful for the upcoming challenges, the risk outweighed the benefit. Carrying a piece of metal that was as tall and wide as he was would only slow him down. He bypassed the debris and evaded another one-pointer, which was too preoccupied with another student to follow him. Present Mick's voice echoed throughout the stadium, announcing the next obstacle, indicating that someone had already reached it. Ahead lay a bottomless ravine that could only be crossed using ropes. Izuku realized he would have to crawl like most others. He skidded to a halt, his eyes darting upward at the towering two-pointer that was now rolling toward him. It was significantly larger than the one-pointer, its clawed fingers flexing as it prepared to strike. The wheels squealed against the uneven ground as it approached, rolling over rocks and the remains of its fellow robots. As it drew closer, a group of students passed by without drawing its attention. The two-pointer lashed out, its right arm aimed at Izuku's face. He barely managed to dodge in time, tumbling into a roll that left his side aching and likely reopened some of his recent cuts. Nevertheless, he scrambled back to his feet and sprinted away as the robot swiped at him from behind, narrowly missing. It quickly adjusted its course, pursuing him with surprising speed. Izuku dove to the side, glancing back just in time to see the robot nearly lose its balance. It was fast but struggled to maintain stability, an advantage Izuku could exploit. He took off in a sprint, checking over his shoulder to ensure the two-pointer was still on his tail. Once he felt he had created enough distance, he slowed slightly, prompting the robot to accelerate. Just as it reached for him, Izuku dove to the side, executing a shoulder roll that was far less painful than his previous attempt. The robot attempted to follow but lost its balance and toppled over, sending dust billowing into the air as it crashed to the ground. Izuku quickly regained his footing and continued running, the ache in his side intensifying with each breath, but it wasn't enough to hinder his progress. Todoroki and Bakugo had long since vanished from sight, and he had yet to spot 𝐼𝐮𝐲, 𝗟𝗏𝐼𝐻, or 𝗍𝗏𝗏. From his perspective, he seemed to be overtaking several competitors, but those were primarily the ones whose quirks were ill-suited for the current challenge. Most of the Hero Corps students, whom he recognized from the cafeteria, were already far ahead. Given that the qualifier had eliminated all but 42 students and there were 40 Hero Corps students, Izuku realized he was likely not performing well. The next obstacle came into view, featuring pillars rising from the darkness, connected by thick ropes. Logically, he knew the school must have implemented safety measures to cushion any falls, but the reality remained that falling from the ropes would mean instant elimination. Ahead of him stood a girl adorned with various support items over her P uniform. A grappling hook shot from a device attached to her belt, and as a small crowd gathered around her, her boots began to slide along the ground. Izuku hadn't realized that support items were permitted under certain circumstances. He guessed they were allowed as long as they were self-made, as they didn't seem necessary for controlling her quirk. Present Mike would have called her out for breaking the rules if she hadn't been compliant. She launched herself off the edge into the ravine, swinging down and extending her arms and legs as if enjoying a ride at an amusement park. As she neared the pillar she had latched onto, she swung her legs forward. Just before impact, her boots halted her descent, and she was propelled upward. Todoroki and Bakugo were far ahead, easily navigating the final stretch of the ravine by either sliding across the ropes with ice or blasting over each drop. They landed at the end of the obstacle simultaneously, jostling each other as they raced to take the lead, followed closely by a few classmates. Gritting his teeth, Izuku surveyed the ravine, mentally mapping out the fastest route. With a plan in mind, he crouched and grasped the rope, taking a deep breath before letting himself fall. Wrapping his arms around the rope to prevent a free fall, he swung beneath it, pulling himself across with the rope secured under his crossed calves. The rope bounced as he moved, but the lack of wind helped him maintain his grip. Reaching the end of the first rope, he turned to grasp the side of the pillar, but it crumbled under his grip, causing him to drop. He caught himself with his other hand, which burned from the rough fibers of the rope. Twisting around, he managed to place a hand on the flat top of the pillar and hoisted himself onto its solid surface. His ribs ached, and his lungs burned from the exertion, the toll of his earlier escape from the one-pointer beginning to take effect. Still he pushed through the pain. Clambering to his feet, he pressed on. As he reached the halfway point, Present Mic's voice rang out again, announcing the next obstacle, a minefield. This was not a challenge Izuku felt particularly equipped to handle, but he knew Bakugo could easily navigate it, and depending on the sensitivity of the mines, Todoroki might also manage with his ice. Now on the last rope, Izuku turned to see two competitors climbing over the edge from their ropes, sprinting toward the final obstacle. Though he couldn't see clearly from his position, he knew many contestants were already at the minefield, as indicated by Present Mic's commentary. The crowd's excitement grew, cheering for whoever was poised to take first place. Just as Izuku reached for the edge of the cliff, the rope jerked to the side, nearly sending him tumbling. He held on tightly, glancing back to see a student on the other end. Struggling to move, yanking the rope side to side as she attempted to pull herself across. With the rope unsteady, Izuku clung to the rough edge of the cliff. Attempting to pull himself up as he had been doing would only cause the rope to slip away, leading to a fall. Present Mic's voice resonated loudly, declaring Bakugo had secured first place, with Todoroki closely following in second. The rope ceased its violent movements. Taking a sharp breath, Izuku launched himself toward the cliff's edge, gripping it with all his strength, hoping the rock beneath his fingers would hold firm. His shoes scraped against the ravine's side, and with a surge of determination, he pushed himself upward, his muscles straining under his weight. He halted, realizing his arms could not lift him any further. But before surrendering to defeat, he made one final effort, swinging his leg over the edge. He then slid his body to safety, flipping onto his back and gasping for air. As he struggled to his feet, he ignored the burning in his lungs. He began to run again, too fatigued to sprint but too resolute to walk. Present Mic announced the competitors who had claimed 7th, 8th, and 9th places. By the time he reached the minefield, 26 positions had been taken. The area was a chaotic expanse of ditches and mounds of dirt created by the landmines. The most damage was concentrated in the center, where many had chosen to race. At least 24 competitors were cautiously navigating around the dormant mines or attempting to avoid them altogether by using a path of ice that Todoroki must have formed earlier. 3 competitors had successfully reached the end of the field. Once they hit the safe path, they ran leisurely, confident they would advance to the next round. Izuku spotted 𝐮𝐲 on the opposite side, just meters from the final stretch. As soon as 𝐮𝐲 stepped onto the path leading to the exit gate, he glanced back, scanning the field. When their eyes met, he simply stared. Izuku understood the unspoken message and nodded, prompting 𝐮𝐲 to turn and head toward the exit, overtaking another competitor who had cleared the field moments after him. From the looks of it, Todoroki's ice was more troublesome than beneficial. Nearly half of those attempting to use the narrow path were struggling to maintain their balance. For Todoroki to run on the ice so effortlessly, his boots must have had superior grip, while Izuku's worn red sneakers certainly did not. He decided to venture into the heart of the minefield, believing it was a reasonable risk. As he leaped from mound to mound of disturbed earth, he quickened his pace, his chest burning. He passed a few competitors who were taking a moment to recover, but many still stood ahead of him. With a sudden burst of energy, Izuku launched into a longer jump. Just before landing, he spotted the unmistakable circular mark of an untouched mine. He instinctively leaned forward as his foot made contact, hoping the force of the explosion would propel him forward rather than backward. The ground erupted beneath him, dirt flying in all directions, and the impact sent Izuku tumbling through the air. Fortunately, the ground where he landed was relatively even, free of mines. He hit the ground on his upper back, rolling to lessen the impact but still feeling the sting. He was grateful for the bandages he had applied the night before, otherwise he would have been bleeding through his P uniform. The momentum allowed him to spring back to his feet immediately, and without hesitation he sprinted forward. He was now halfway across, but he still hadn't caught up. Ahead of him lay a solitary mine, untouched beneath the earth. Taking a deep breath, Izuku timed his jump perfectly. His heel struck the edge of the mine's circular mark, and the force propelled him straight to the path beyond the minefield. After a particularly rough tumble, he scrambled to his feet, urging his legs to carry him further. As he crossed the threshold into the sunlight once more, the crowd erupted in cheers for the final contestants. When the 42nd competitor cleared the end of the hallway, another wave of confetti rained down from cannons along the stands. Izuku wondered if the crowd would still cheer if he had relied on his quirk to win. His body felt on fire, his shoulder blade and upper back ached from the rolls, and his hands still throbbed from gripping the ropes. Yet, he was moving on to the next round without having to use his quirk, and that was what mattered. No amount of pain could stop him from smiling with joy. Wiping his eyes to clear away the tears, he scanned the contestants further from the hallway. His gaze landed on Shinsu's fluffy hair above a girl adorned with support items. Once he had wiped away the last of his tears, he approached 𝐼𝐻𝐻, waving as soon as his classmate noticed him. 𝐼𝐻𝐻 didn't wave back but took a few steps toward Izuku to meet him halfway. Izuku felt a mix of emotions as he acknowledged the close call. Just then, 𝗟𝗟𝐼𝐻𝐿 called out to him, jogging over with excitement. Before he could respond, a firm hand landed on his shoulder, causing him to jump. However, he didn't instinctively pull away, having sensed the presence behind him before the touch. The hand quickly withdrew. When he glanced back to see if anyone else had noticed, he felt a wave of embarrassment. Shinso and 𝗟𝗟𝐻𝐿 were watching him, their expressions a mixture of concern. Behind him, Kirano blinked at her hand, checking her claws as if she feared she had accidentally pricked him. Izuku apologized, his gaze downcast but still aware of the three's hands at their sides. He fought the urge to dig his fingers into the fabric of his uniform. It was a personal struggle, and he hoped they would understand. Izuku felt a wave of discomfort wash over him in the silence that followed his apology. Shinso, sensing the tension, turned to the others and inquired about their identities. Izuku shot him a grateful glance, recognizing the subtle shift in Shinsu's expression. As introductions were made, Izuku allowed himself to relax a little. When they finished sharing their names, Izuku smiled and expressed his relief that everyone had made it. Kirano chimed in, suggesting that Izuku might want to aim for a higher rank this time if he wanted to stand out. Izuku nodded, acknowledging her point with an awkward grin. Just then, Midnight interrupted their conversation, announcing that the real excitement was about to begin. She raised her WHP and gestured toward the screen, where a selection of events began to spin, creating an illusion of randomness. However, Izuku knew that the next event had already been predetermined. The wheel gradually slowed until it revealed the words, Cavalry Battle. This was a new addition to U.S. Sports Festival, and Izuku felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity. He had never been fond of cavalry battles, having never participated in one himself. In junior high, his classmates had kept him at a distance during such events. Although 𝐒𝐵𝐵𝐸 was the only one who knew about his quirk and was willing to spar with him, Izuku doubted anyone else would want to team up with him now. He wrestled with the thought of being disqualified if he couldn't find partners. Perhaps some would join him, thinking he wouldn't take their quirks if they cooperated. As Midnight began explaining the rules, Izuku tried to envision a potential team. He pushed aside the nagging fear that everyone he approached would reject him. Teams could consist of 2 to 4 members, with larger teams having a better chance of success. But where would he find enough teammates? Midnight paused dramatically, building anticipation before revealing that first place would earn not 210 points, but a staggering 10 million. Izuku's mind momentarily faltered at the enormity of that number. With such a reward, 𝐾𝐭𝐚𝐲 would undoubtedly assemble a team of classmates he deemed worthy, and he would not shy away from taking points from others. Izuku felt a sinking realization that his own team, if he managed to form one, would likely become 𝐾𝐭𝐚𝐲's target. He questioned whether his potential partners would flee after learning about his quirk, or if they would reconsider after hearing about 𝐾𝐭𝐚𝐲's fierce determination. The only person Izuku could think of who might partner with him was 𝗪𝐶, but even then, they would need more members to stand a chance against 𝐾𝐭𝐚𝐲. Izuku hoped that 𝗟𝗏𝐼𝐻 and 𝗍𝗏 would team up with their classmates. 𝗪𝐶's voice broke through his thoughts, louder than usual but not quite a shout. He pointed out that Izuku was mumbling. Izuku swallowed hard, squeezing his eyes shut momentarily before reopening them. He admitted that the pressure was overwhelming and asked who 𝗪𝐶 planned to partner with. 𝗍𝗏 responded that she would seek out her classmates, as she was most familiar with their quirks. Izuku realized her reasoning was sound, even if he hadn't shared his own quirk with her. 𝗟𝗏𝐻 echoed her sentiment, expressing her intention to partner with her classmates as well. Izuku waved his hands in understanding, assuring them that he completely understood their choices. Once they left, 𝗪𝐶 turned to Izuku and stated that they would be partners. Izuku was taken aback, barely able to process the offer. He asked if 𝗪𝐶 truly wanted to team up with him, to which 𝗪𝐶 replied with a condition: Izuku had to use his quirk. Izuku inhaled sharply, grappling with the implications. He knew he should use his quirk if necessary, but he hesitated at the thought of how others would perceive him. Would it seem villainous to use his abilities to succeed at the expense of others? 𝗪𝐶 challenged him, pointing out that he had used his quirk in the previous round without hesitation. Izuku felt conflicted, biting his tongue in frustration. He believed that 𝗪𝐶's quirk was not villainous, but he struggled to reconcile his own feelings about using his powers. People often judge based on the potential of one's abilities rather than the actual actions taken. Izuku felt the sting of his own thoughts as he pressed his nails into his palms, trying to suppress the turmoil within. He believed that using his quirk would only bring harm to others. 𝗪𝐶 pointed out that during the entrance exam, he had attempted to sabotage others, questioning whether that was truly villainous. Izuku argued that it was necessary for success, but he couldn't bring himself to take away someone else's quirk, knowing it would leave them defenseless. 𝗪𝐶 insisted that one couldn't afford to spare enemies, but Izuku countered that those he faced weren't enemies, they simply shared the same aspirations. He believed that using his quirk would 𝗟𝗏𝐻 them of their dreams and diminish their identities. 𝗪𝐶 claimed that while he took free will, Izuku took a piece of someone's essence, suggesting that his own actions were worse. Izuku struggled to respond, his gaze falling to the ground as tears threatened to spill. Their quirks were indeed different. 𝗪𝐶's was not villainous, while Izuku's felt inherently wrong to use. He feared that embracing his ability would confirm the negative perceptions others had of him, leading to a complete loss of trust. 𝗪𝐶 pressed him to stop complaining and just use his quirk. Izuku felt a surge of determination to remain silent, believing that if he didn't provoke 𝗪𝐶, he might calm down. 𝗪𝐶 took a moment to breathe, reiterating that his quirk wasn't villainous, challenging Izuku's perception of his own abilities. Izuku remained quiet, knowing that speaking up would only lead to further conflict. 𝗪𝐶 accused him of denying the truth, asserting that his quirk could swiftly neutralize threats before they could cause harm. Izuku, however, reminded him that their opponents were not villains, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Despite the pain from his earlier injuries, Izuku felt tears welling up. He wanted to inflict pain on himself to distract from the emotional turmoil, but he refrained, knowing 𝗪𝐸 would notice. He clenched his fists, biting his tongue to keep himself composed. 𝗪𝐸 insisted that the teachers needed to see Izuku's quirk in action. Izuku wiped his eyes, feeling embarrassed as he tried to clean himself up. He understood that if he didn't demonstrate his ability soon, the hero course teachers would only have second-hand information about him. He had already hesitated during the first event, almost jeopardizing his chances. To redeem himself, he needed to utilize his quirk in the upcoming rounds. He worried about All Might watching him struggle, knowing the pro had encouraged him to embrace his abilities. Izuku questioned why he was convincing himself that he could succeed without using his quirk. Finally, he met 𝗪𝐸's intense gaze and reluctantly agreed to try. 𝗪𝐸 stood up, turning away as Izuku wiped away the last of his tears. He knew his eyes would still be red, but there was little he could do about it. Most of the other participants had already formed teams, and the timer above indicated they had limited time left. Izuku began to apologize for taking so long, but 𝗪𝐸 dismissed him with an eye roll and walked off in what seemed like a random direction. As he moved away, Izuku fought the urge to harm himself again. He felt that whatever bond he and 𝗪𝐸 had was now strained. He hesitated to label their relationship as friendship, unsure of how 𝗪𝐸 viewed it. Despite 𝗪𝐸's apparent acceptance of Izuku's quirk, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that using it on him might change things. He clenched his teeth and pressed his nails into his shoulder, finding a strange comfort in the pain. The priority now was to advance to the next round. If they failed, they would leave no impression on the hero course teachers. Standing idle would only waste more time. Izuku resolved to help 𝗪𝐸 find partners and devise a strategy that could lead them to victory. They needed allies to stand a chance against formidable opponents like Bakugo. He recognized that using his quirk could be essential for their success. If he refrained from using it, he would be setting himself up for failure, not only for himself but for 𝗪𝐸 and their chances of progressing further. He could maintain a clear conscience if he failed due to his own choices, but he would struggle to forgive himself if someone else suffered because of his inaction. He faced a difficult choice: either refrain from using his quirk to assist the other teams, which would ultimately harm his own, or use his quirk to aid his team at the expense of others. In either scenario, he would end up losing. After taking a moment to compose himself, he lifted his gaze to scan the field for anyone still seeking a partner. 𝗪𝐸 had already vanished into the crowd of contestants, but Izuku knew he had gone left. So, he decided to move right, weaving around groups that were deep in strategy discussions. Just as he managed to escape the bulk of the crowd, a girl adorned with various support items skidded to a halt in front of him, nearly colliding with him. Her face was mere centimeters from his, causing Izuku to flinch back, almost losing his balance. She urgently inquired if he was in the general course, expressing her relief at finding him after a long search. She seemed oblivious to his startled reaction, likely because she was too focused on her own excitement. Up close, Izuku could see the details of her gear, though he could only guess the functions of many of the items. She sported steampunk goggles pushed up on her forehead, a headpiece with curled tubes resembling horns, and 𝗟𝐻𝐸 that held an unseen device on her back. A small trunk rested behind her, presumably filled with more support items. Izuku confirmed that he was indeed in the general course, prompting her to beam with enthusiasm. She eagerly suggested they team up, explaining that her goal was to get her inventions noticed by the support companies in the stands, while he aimed to impress the hero course instructors. She assumed he would want to stand out in this round. Izuku realized she likely crafted the support items herself. He hesitated, wondering why she hadn't approached Bakugo instead, who would undoubtedly draw more attention than he would. However, she might have already asked Bakugo, only to be turned down in a way that made Izuku cringe at the thought. The girl introduced herself as 𝐒𝐻𝐸, undeterred by Izuku's silence. She opened her trunk and began rummaging through it, mentioning that she had packed a variety of powerful items. Izuku introduced himself as well, albeit somewhat shyly. She handed him a compact metal box, which he caught just in time. As she continued to search through her trunk, he examined the item in his hands. She explained that it was called the Iron Spider, designed to cover blind spots while he focused on his opponents. She noted that it would be perfect for his needs and asked about his quirk. Izuku felt a surge of anxiety, his muscles tensing at the thought of revealing his ability. After a moment of hesitation, he managed to explain that he could take quirks from others. Her eyes lit up with excitement at the potential of creating support items tailored to his abilities, suggesting he visit her studio once he became a hero student. Izuku blinked in surprise, unable to respond immediately. Mei laughed, sharing that her own quirk was not particularly useful for the current situation. This made Izuku wonder if she was unconcerned about him taking her quirk, as it didn't seem to hold much value for her. She then presented him with a uniquely shaped gun, the Quad Blaster, which fired capture nets. Although she had forgotten to bring extra cartridges, Izuku recognized its potential usefulness alongside the 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿. Eager to team up, she asked if he had any other teammates in mind. Izuku glanced around, realizing 𝗟𝐿 was nowhere to be seen. He mentioned that they needed to find him, as he was also in the general course. With a sense of urgency, they set off in the direction Izuku last saw 𝗟𝐿. He felt a wave of anxiety as he checked the time, noting that only 5 minutes remained. They navigated through the crowd, Izuku keeping an eye out for 𝗟𝐿's distinctive hair. Spotting him across the field, he gestured for Mei to follow as they moved into a more open area, where he saw 𝗟𝐿 engaged in conversation with one of their classmates, 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿, the boy with the icy appearance that had caught Izuku's attention on the first day. Though they occasionally shared a table during lunch, the classmates knew little more than each other's names and reasons for joining the general course. It was surprising to see 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 advance to the second event, as he had no intention of transferring like 𝗟𝐿 or Izuku. He had often expressed his frustration about the general course receiving so little attention. Izuku greeted 𝗟𝐿 and 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿, primarily to announce his presence. 𝗟𝐿 focused on 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿, who stood beside Izuku. She introduced herself enthusiastically, leaning close to 𝗟𝐿, who leaned back slightly to maintain distance. She expressed her longing to join their team, mentioning her support items from the support course that could be very beneficial. 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 confirmed his participation, chuckling at the idea of a team composed solely of non-hero course students, suggesting it would be a significant upset if they succeeded. Izuku noted that they would need to steal headbands to accumulate enough points. He paused, contemplating how to explain their situation. He mentioned that Bakugo, who had a significant lead in points, would likely be aggressive and target their team. Izuku feared that Bakugo might focus on them specifically, especially towards the end of the round when they would have little time to recover points. 𝗟𝐿 inquired about Bakugo's animosity towards Izuku. Realizing there was no point in hiding the truth, Izuku decided to reveal his quirk, hoping it wouldn't deter 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 from staying on the team. He explained that he could take other people's quirks for his own use. 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 reacted with calmness, showing no panic or fear, only a hint of hesitation. This response was preferable to 𝗏𝐻's excitement. 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿's genuine reaction indicated he was processing the information thoughtfully. Izuku reflected on how people might view him as a villain due to his quirk, but he hoped to prove himself as a hero one day. 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 questioned whether it was fair for Bakugo to dislike him for something he couldn't control. Izuku clarified that he had not taken Bakugo's quirk intentionally, leading 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 to conclude that Bakugo was simply being unreasonable. Despite the tension, 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐿 expressed his willingness to partner with Izuku, recognizing the potential advantages of his quirk. He explained his own quirk, Frost Breath, which allowed him to freeze things with his breath. He noted that while he could only use it a few times before tiring, Izuku could take it and extend their capabilities. 𝗏𝐻 suggested that Izuku should be the one to ride, as he could utilize their quirks and any others that came near him. With only 2 minutes remaining, Izuku urged his teammates to quickly share their quirks for clarity. After they explained their abilities, he noted that they had a total of 105 points. Most teams would likely end up with 0 points by the round's end, but they needed to take headbands from others to ensure their safety. 𝗏𝐻 chimed in that using her inventions would be helpful. She turned to Izuku, noting that he was wearing the iron spider suit. He would also need to hold the quad blaster, as the rest of the team would be occupied. Izuku nodded, adjusting the pack around his shoulders despite the discomfort it caused his injuries. He was informed that it would activate automatically after pressing the button on the left side. 𝐾𝐞𝐭 was suggested to take the front position, as it would allow him a broader range of options without endangering the others. 𝐻𝐼𝐬 and 𝗪𝐸 were asked to take the back, which they agreed to. 𝐻𝐼𝐬 was also advised to remove her boots, as they could hinder their teamwork and were difficult to walk in. With a sigh of resignation, she knelt down to undo the straps of her boots. Meanwhile, 𝗪𝐸 and 𝐾𝐞𝐭 confirmed their positions. Izuku checked the timer on the screen, noting that only a little over a minute remained. They needed to prepare for 𝗏𝗏, and Izuku felt the weight of 𝗪𝐸's narrowed gaze. He was aware of 𝗪𝐸's thoughts and felt his heart race, but he couldn't ignore the reality of 𝗏𝗏's approach. The thought of 𝗏𝗏's aggression made Izuku anxious, as he feared he would be unable to protect his teammates. He worried that his inability to strategize would lead to their downfall, and he felt overwhelmed by the pressure. 𝐾𝐞𝐭 broke the tension by asking about the other teams. Izuku turned his attention to him, feeling the urgency of the situation. He realized he was wasting precious time. He acknowledged that 𝗏𝗏 would likely target them, but speculated that other teams might go after 𝗏𝗏's points instead, especially those from Class 1B who hadn't seen him in action. Their advantage was that they weren't Hero Corps students, so they might not be seen as a threat. However, this could also work against them, as some teams might target them for easy points. Izuku considered the risks of allowing their points to be taken early on, which could keep them off the radar for a while. He glanced at the clock, feeling the pressure mount. There was little they could do to prevent 𝗏𝗏 from coming after them. Suddenly, the buzzer rang, echoing throughout the stadium, and midnight called for everyone to get their headbands and take their positions. Izuku felt a wave of despair wash over him, fearing that their efforts would be in vain. 𝗪𝐸 stood up, deliberately avoiding Izuku's gaze as he wiped away the remnants of his tears. Izuku knew his eyes were still red and puffy, but there was little he could do about it. Most teams had already formed groups of 4, and when he glanced at the timer again, it showed 8.5 minutes remaining. Izuku began to apologize for the time lost, but 𝗪𝐸 rolled his eyes and turned away as soon as he started speaking. He walked off in what seemed like a random direction. Izuku felt a pang of regret for their relationship, unsure of what to call it. He didn't want to assume they were friends, especially given the uncertainty of 𝗪𝐸's feelings. Determined to move forward, Izuku focused on the task at hand. He needed to help 𝗪𝐸 find partners and devise a plan to increase their chances against 𝗏𝗏. Using his quirk was essential for their success, and he realized that if he didn't utilize it during the event, he would be jeopardizing not only his own chances but also 𝗪𝐸's and the team's. He took a deep breath, scanning the field for anyone still looking for a partner, ready to push aside his doubts and focus on the challenge ahead. 𝗪𝐸 had already vanished into the crowd of contestants. Izuku, knowing 𝗪𝐸 had gone left, decided to head right, weaving around groups that were deep in strategy discussions. Just as he managed to escape the bulk of the crowd, a girl adorned with various support items skidded to a halt in front of him. She nearly launched herself toward him, her face coming dangerously close to his. Izuku flinched back, almost losing his balance. The girl asked if he was in the general course, her voice filled with urgency as she expressed her relief at finding him after what felt like an eternity. She seemed oblivious to his startled reaction. Up close, Izuku could see the details of her gear, though he could only guess at the functions of many of the items. She wore steampunk goggles pushed up on her forehead, a headpiece with curled tubes resembling horns, and 𝗟𝗏𝐻𝐼𝐬 that held something on her back that he couldn't quite see. A small trunk rested behind her legs, likely filled with more support items. Izuku confirmed that he was indeed in the general course, and her face lit up with excitement as she brushed a pink dreadlock out of her eyes. She exclaimed that he was trying to transfer into the hero course, noting that most general course students barely managed to get through the first round. He confirmed her assumption, and she proposed that they team up, suggesting they could help each other. She wanted her creations to be noticed by support companies, while he aimed to catch the attention of the hero course teachers. Izuku realized she had likely crafted the support items herself. He hesitated, wondering why she hadn't approached 𝗏𝗏 instead, who would surely stand out more than he could. But it was likely that 𝗏𝗏 had declined her offer in a less-than-friendly manner, which made Izuku cringe at the thought. The girl introduced herself as 𝐒𝐻𝐻𝐸, undeterred by his silence. She opened her trunk and revealed a variety of gadgets, eager to show him what she had packed. Izuku introduced himself, and she handed him a compact metal box, which he managed to catch just in time. She continued rummaging through her trunk, barely acknowledging him. She explained that he needed something to protect himself while pursuing other teams, especially since he didn't have many points yet. She presented the 𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐼, a device designed to cover his blind spots, allowing him to focus on the front while it guarded his back. She asked about his quirk. Izuku felt a surge of anxiety, his muscles protesting as he struggled to respond. After a moment, he managed to say that he could take quirks from others. Her eyes widened with excitement as she considered the possibilities, imagining the support items she could create for him based on the quirks he could acquire. She then showed him a uniquely shaped gun called the Quad Blaster, which could shoot capture nets. Although she had forgotten to bring extra cartridges, Izuku still found the weapon intriguing and acknowledged that it would be a significant help, along with the 𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐼. Eager to team up, she asked if he had any other teammates in mind. Izuku glanced around but couldn't see 𝗟𝗟𝐿. He mentioned that they needed to find him, as he was also in the general course. Mei enthusiastically agreed, and as Izuku led the way, he felt a wave of urgency when he noticed only 5 minutes remained. They navigated through the crowd, Izuku keeping his eyes peeled for 𝗟𝗟𝐿's distinctive hair. When he spotted it across the field, he signaled for Mei to follow him. They emerged into a more open area, where Izuku saw 𝗟𝗟𝐿 engaged in conversation with one of their classmates, Quirk, who had a striking icy appearance. Although they occasionally shared a table during lunch, they knew little about each other beyond their names and reasons for being in the general course. It was surprising to see Quirk had made it to the second event, as he had no intention of transferring like 𝗟𝗟𝐿 or Izuku. Though he had mentioned his frustration over the general course receiving so little attention, Izuku greeted 𝗟𝗟𝐿 and Quirk to announce his presence. 𝗟𝗟𝐿's gaze remained fixed on 𝐻𝐻𝐸, who stood beside Izuku. She introduced herself enthusiastically, leaning in close, prompting 𝗟𝗟𝐿 to lean back slightly to avoid contact. He responded with his name, and 𝗻𝐻𝐸 explained her longing to join their team, highlighting the support items she had brought from the support course, which could prove to be very useful. Quirk confirmed his participation, chuckling at the idea of a team composed entirely of non-hero course students. He noted that if they succeeded, it would be quite an upset. Izuku agreed, acknowledging 𝗟𝗟𝐿's brief smirk before it vanished. He mentioned the necessity of stealing headbands to accumulate points, pausing thoughtfully before continuing. He felt it was important for his teammates to understand the situation. He expressed concern about 𝗂𝐵𝐸, who would likely attempt to take points from others rather than settling for his own. Izuku warned that avoiding 𝗂𝐵𝐸 would be crucial for their survival in the competition, as he was exceptionally strong and aggressive. Quirk inquired if Izuku knew 𝗂𝐵𝐸, to which Izuku grimaced but confirmed their acquaintance. He elaborated that 𝗂𝐵𝐸 was not the type to play defensively. He aimed for victory by the widest margin possible, which meant he would target their points. Izuku felt compelled to explain why 𝗂𝐵𝐸 might focus on him. He knew that revealing his quirk was necessary, even if it might cause Quirk to reconsider their partnership. He took a deep breath and shared that he could take others' quirks for his own use. Quirk's calm reaction surprised Izuku. Instead of panic, there was a hint of hesitation, indicating his apprehension but also a willingness to understand. 𝗻𝐻𝐸 seemed even more excited by the revelation, while Quirk's cautious response was expected. Izuku appreciated that Quirk was trying to suppress his fear, recognizing the challenge he would face if he became a hero. He hoped that one day, people would see him as trustworthy rather than a villain. Quirk questioned whether it was fair to hate someone for their quirk, suggesting that Izuku had no control over it. Izuku felt confused by this perspective, clarifying that he had never taken 𝗂𝐵𝐸's quirk. Quirk dismissed 𝗂𝐵𝐸's behavior as simply being unpleasant. 𝗟𝗟𝐿 chuckled at the exchange. After shooting an apologetic glance at 𝗟𝗟𝐿 and 𝗻𝐻𝐸, Izuku offered that he would understand if Quirk didn't want to partner with him due to his quirk. However, Quirk countered that he saw potential in Izuku's ability, suggesting that they could use it strategically against 𝗂𝐵𝐸. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 introduced his own quirk, Frost Breath, explaining its freezing capabilities and limitations. He mentioned that if he grew tired, Izuku could take over and utilize it for their advantage. Izuku hesitated, unsure if he should accept, but 𝐼𝐻𝐬 reassured him that it was fine as long as he returned it. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 interjected, suggesting Izuku should be the rider, allowing him to use any quirks from teammates and opponents alike. With only 2 minutes remaining, Izuku urged everyone to quickly share their quirks again for clarity. After they explained, he noted their current point total and the importance of acquiring headbands from other teams to ensure their safety in the competition. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 chimed in, mentioning her support items, and turned to Izuku, suggesting he wear the Iron Spider. Izuku hesitated as he adjusted the quad blaster pack around his shoulders, feeling the pressure on his wounds. He was instructed that it would activate automatically after pressing the button on the left side. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 was designated to the front for a wider range of action without endangering the others. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 and 𝗪𝐿 were suggested to take the back. Izuku wondered if it would be better for 𝐻𝐻𝐬 to remove her boots, which were cumbersome and could hinder their teamwork. With a look of dismay, 𝐻𝐻𝐬 agreed and knelt to undo the straps of her boots. 𝗪𝐿 and 𝐼𝐻𝐬 also confirmed their positions. Izuku checked the timer on the screen. Only a little over a minute remained. They needed to prepare for Bakugo. Izuku noticed 𝗪𝐿's narrowed eyes, aware of the unspoken tension regarding his relationship with Bakugo. Izuku's heart raced as he thought about the impending confrontation. He felt weak for needing 𝗪𝐿's encouragement to support his teammates, knowing Bakugo would come for them. The thought of being unable to protect his friends weighed heavily on him. 𝐼𝐻𝐬's voice broke through his thoughts, asking about the other teams. Izuku realized he was wasting precious time. He acknowledged that Bakugo would likely target them, but speculated that other teams might go after Bakugo's points, especially those from Class 1B who hadn't seen him in action. Their lack of status as Hero Corps students could be both an advantage and a disadvantage. They might not be seen as a threat, allowing some teams to target them for easy points. However, this strategy was risky. The buzzer rang, echoing through the stadium as midnight announced the start of the cavalry battle. Izuku felt a wave of dread wash over him, fearing the outcome would be his fault. The team quickly formed their positions, and as Izuku steadied himself with the support of his teammates, he discreetly pressed his fingers into his skin, focusing on the pain to distract from the discomfort in his feet. He regretted not using his time to devise a plan instead of questioning 𝗪𝐿's intentions. Now, he would have to think on his feet during the event, knowing he had to keep an eye out for threats while also being responsible for guiding his team. With a final burst of pain in his shoulder, Izuku clicked the button on the Iron Spider, preparing for action. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 expressed her enthusiasm, declaring they could win easily by taking headbands. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 and 𝗪𝐿 agreed, their confidence evident. As the buzzer sounded, signaling the start of the battle, all teams sprang into action. Bakugo and Todoroki's teams moved swiftly, engaging in fierce competition. Ice and fire clashed spectacularly, creating a dazzling display. Izuku recognized that using his quirk against Bakugo was his best option, despite the risks. He understood Bakugo would not hold back, assuming Izuku lacked the courage to confront him. Scanning the electronic board displaying the teams, Izuku counted 11 in total, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. Before Izuku could double-check, he felt his teammates tense beneath him. One team had separated from the group they had been near at the start of the round, now charging toward Izuku's team. Although he didn't recognize anyone on their four-person team, he noted their distinctive features. The rider had silver hair and an almost feathery crown around his eyes, which could have been an eye mask or simply his eyelashes. Unfortunately, his quirk was not evident from his appearance. From his position, Izuku could see the left horse but not the right. The left horse's most distinguishing feature was a headband, while his hair and eyes were dark gray, showing no signs of a mutant-type quirk. Izuku couldn't guess what his quirk might be. However, he assumed the front horse had a quirk that justified his position. His tousled hair was the color of sand, and he had an impressive set of exposed teeth, reminiscent of ectoplasm but less unsettling. Although his teeth were eye-catching, Izuku doubted they were related to his quirk. It was more likely a trait inherited from one of his parents. It didn't make sense for him to be at the front if his quirk was merely enhanced jaw strength or something similar. Close-range quirks weren't particularly useful in a cavalry battle when one was a horse. Izuku called out to 𝐼𝐻𝐬, hoping his voice would carry over the noise of quirks clashing, contestants shouting, and the audience cheering. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 pulled back his head as he inhaled, then released his breath toward the front horse's feet. His team had just enough time to slow down, but not enough to dodge. 𝐼𝐻𝐬's icy breath curled around the front horse's feet, forming small crystals that left him stuck to the ground. As the front horse began to struggle, Izuku felt 𝗟𝗟𝐬𝐿 and 𝗏𝐻𝐼𝐿 falter. Beneath his teammates' feet, the packed dirt was turning into mud, pulling their legs into the ground. The ground began to shift just beyond the front horses' toes. This was the work of Teeth Boy's quirk. Could he solely transform the ground into a quicksand-like substance? Or was his quirk more versatile? In the open field, Izuku doubted the specifics mattered. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 shouted in frustration, and 𝗟𝗟𝐬𝐿 grunted in agreement, expressing their inability to escape. Before Izuku could respond, he felt the iron spider were to life, snapping open instantly. 4 metal spider legs extended in the same direction, causing Izuku to nearly stumble forward, instinctively flinching from the sudden noise and movement. Fortunately, his team remained unaffected by his misstep, as they were still stuck. He vowed to keep the iron spider in the back of his mind to avoid making that mistake again. The spider legs blocked an attack from a girl whose quirk Izuku couldn't identify from his position. All he saw was a flesh-colored cord shooting toward him, which the iron spider knocked out of the air. When the cord retreated, the spider legs folded back into the backpack, and the pack's opening snapped shut. 𝗟𝗟𝐿 called out to the front horse, who had managed to free one foot from 𝐼𝐻𝐬's ice, demanding to know about his quirk. The boy snorted in response, but before he could say anything, the back horse in the headband hissed for him to stay silent, suggesting that was how 𝗟𝗟𝐿's quirk worked. 𝗟𝗟𝐿 huffed in annoyance. Izuku glanced around and noted another team approaching from their left. Bakugo and Todoroki were still engaged in battle, but another team had joined the fray. Despite this, the scoreboard still showed Bakugo's team with 10 million points. After checking the timer, Izuku scanned his surroundings again. If they were going to score points before Bakugo targeted them, now was their chance. Bakugo would undoubtedly come for them, and he would make it personal. Izuku would need to take his quirk while simultaneously defending against him. When Bakugo reached for his throat, Izuku would have to use one hand to take his quirk and the other to swat his hand away. Without an explosion, it shouldn't be too difficult. Izuku suggested they retreat but perhaps approach the other team. The girl with the purple hair had a long-range quirk that could be useful, and they wouldn't be left alone. He asked if they should try for their points. 𝗏𝐻𝐼𝐿 enthusiastically agreed, and 𝗟𝗟𝐿 nodded. Free from the mud, his team followed his suggestion and sped away. As they did, the back horse of the other team finally shook the front horse's shoulder hard enough to rouse him from 𝗟𝗟𝐿's brainwashing. However, he was too disoriented to move immediately, and when his team finally began to move, they ran straight into a net from the quad blaster. The team struggled to free themselves, clawing at the net without any quirk to help them untangle. The invisible person's team was much closer now, and the iron spider lashed out repeatedly to block the purple-haired girl's quirk. She was the front horse, accompanied by a back horse with notably large lips and another with a rock-like head. Neither had a discernible quirk. Izuku raised both hands to protect his temples, realizing he didn't need to keep the quad blaster aimed at them. A net wouldn't do much against the headphone jacks. He bent his knees and offered the quad blaster to 𝗏𝐻𝐼𝐿, explaining that it would be better for him to have both hands free. She grasped the object delicately by the grip with 2 fingers, her other hand resting on 𝐼𝐻𝐬's shoulder. Headphone Jack Girl had the ability to bypass the iron spider's defenses, but if Izuku kept his arms close to his face, he could prevent her from snatching the headbands around his neck. However, they needed to move in closer to effectively use 𝗟𝗟𝐿's brainwashing on the rider, which would put their points at greater risk. Perhaps Izuku could seize the 2 headphone jacks and stop her from attacking again, allowing them to close the distance for 𝗟𝗟𝐿 to take control of the rider's mind. Izuku suggested maintaining their distance, believing he could manage her quirk from afar. Their team halted abruptly and began to back away, with Izuku placing a hand on Quirkyu's shoulder for support while offering apologies. The opposing team, led by Invisible Person, also paused, prompting Izuku to squint at them, trying to compensate for his inability to rest his chin on his hand. He assessed that the purple-haired girl's quirk was likely the only significant threat they posed. Just then, Headphone Jack Girl unleashed her quirk again, but the Iron Spider deflected the attack. Izuku remained focused on their opponent's movements, hands positioned defensively near his head. He reasoned that if the backriders had effective long-range quirks, they would have used them by now. Conversely, if they possessed close-range abilities, they would be attempting to close the gap. The purple-haired girl's quirk would certainly be formidable in close combat. Quirky inquired about the implications of this analysis. 𝐼𝐻 interjected, urging them to move forward and trust in her invention to protect them from the girl's quirk. Although Izuku felt less confident in his reflexes at a shorter distance, he had faith in the Iron Spider, which had yet to fail him. He took a deep breath and agreed to advance. As they closed the distance, the opposing team attempted to retreat. Izuku checked the timer, noting they had 11.5 minutes remaining. Behind them, Bakugo and Todoroki were still engaged in battle, while the other team Izuku had previously noticed had likely vanished in search of easier prey. He suspected that Bakugo, even while distracted by Todoroki's team, had successfully deterred any other competitors. After confirming they were not being followed, Izuku refocused on the task at hand. Now closer, the Iron Spider's legs struggled to keep pace with Headphone Jack Girl's rapid strikes. She attacked from various angles, moving her headphone jacks in opposite directions before bringing them together, only to split again as the Iron Spider lashed out. When they were near enough for Quirky to aim another icy breath at Headphone Jack Girl's feet, she managed to slip past the Iron Spider's defenses. Izuku swiftly reached out, catching one of her headphone jacks just in time, gripping it firmly and pulling it away from the headbands around his neck. As she struggled to escape his hold, he prepared for the other headphone jack. It arced over his head, but when two mechanical spider legs intercepted it, she retracted the jack. Now focused on the ice that bound her to the ground, she was unprepared for Izuku's team, who had already closed the gap. 𝐼𝐻 requested the headbands, to which Headphone Jack Girl responded with disbelief, while Invisible Girl echoed her sentiment. 𝐼𝐻 commanded her to remain still, his gaze fixed on Headphone Jack Girl, whose eyes shifted from black to light gray. He directed his attention toward Invisible Girl, instructing her to remove all her headbands and toss them over. Initially, there was no visible response from Invisible Girl. However, the 4 headbands around her neck began to unravel as the Velcro fastenings came apart. In their current position, the backriders could not reach them, allowing the headbands to sail toward 𝐼𝐻 without resistance. Izuku leaned forward to catch them, dropping the headphone jack just as they approached his hands. Even if the impact caused 𝐼𝐻's brainwashing to wane, Headphone Jack Girl would not have time to reclaim the headbands. He secured the headbands around his fingers and quickly fastened them around his neck, pressing the Velcro pieces together. As he had done with his own team's headbands, he flipped the new 4 so that the blank sides faced outward. With that, they resumed their movement, circling the center of the stadium where other teams were engaged in combat. On the scoreboard, their team had ascended from 8th place, thanks to several teams losing their headbands, to 5th place. Izuku had anticipated this rise, despite not knowing the name of the rider and, consequently, their point total. Seeing their rank improve on the screen filled him with hope, especially as Bakugo and Todoroki remained preoccupied with each other. However, he knew their distraction would not last. When the time came, Bakugo would likely be too focused on Izuku to heed anything 𝐼𝐻 said. He could not rely on Quirkyu's quirk either. The front rider on Bakugo's team might be there precisely because he could withstand Bakugo's explosive power. Even if the front rider couldn't, Bakugo would still unleash his quirk, which would quickly melt any frost Quirky could create. 𝐼𝐻 called out to Izuku, suggesting he could have taken her quirk. Izuku felt a pang of tension and admitted he hadn't thought of it, apologizing. Yet, he realized Bakugo might respond to him instead. 𝐼𝐻 would be more lenient than Bakugo if Izuku were to take his quirk. He could brainwash Bakugo and ask him to hand over the 10 million headbands first, ensuring he didn't drop them while attempting to catch more. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 reassured him that they didn't need it, but reminded him not to forget next time. Izuku promised he wouldn't, his voice firm with determination. With that, he wiped his palm across the side of his shirt and took the quad blaster back from 𝐼𝐻𝐬, hoping the gun wouldn't slip from his now less sweaty hand. He glanced at the timer once more, noting that they had about 7 minutes left and still lacked enough points to advance to the next round. However, they were not far behind the fourth-place team, so any headbands they could find would likely give them the edge they needed. 𝗪𝐿 gestured to their left, indicating that another team was rushing toward them. They sidestepped as the opposing team dashed past, though Izuku nearly lost his balance, unwilling to remove his hands from his face to steady himself. Among the riders was 𝐼𝐻𝐬, who grinned widely, revealing sharp fangs. The horse opposite 𝐼𝐻𝐬 had skin as dark as 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐻𝐬's hero costume, with shaggy gray hair that stood out starkly. The front horse appeared much more ordinary, lacking any visible features of his quirk and possessing expressionless black eyes. 𝐼𝐻𝐬's team changed direction and charged at them again. When they were close enough, Izuku aimed the quad blaster and fired. The opposing team stumbled in their haste to stop, but the net ensnared them all the same, draping over the rider's head and hanging down to the horse's knees. The rider struggled against the ropes, but even when 𝐼𝐻𝐬 released his grip on the front horse's shoulder to assist, the net remained firmly in place. That was until the front horse took a deep breath and exhaled, his breath solidifying in midair and pushing against the net. Initially, it resisted, but the bubble created by the front horse continued to expand. Eventually, the net curled around the bubble above the team's heads. With a shove from the rider, the bubble and net drifted away. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 wasted no time in exhaling his own quirk-powered breath onto the front horse's feet. Instead of coating the horse's shoes, it left a frosty sheen on the ground beneath them. Nevertheless, it effectively trapped the front horse unless he wanted to risk slipping. It wouldn't hold them long, but it was enough to keep them at bay for a few seconds. 𝗪𝐻𝐬 asked for the headbands, his tone confident. The rider snorted and laughed, feeling overconfident. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 huffed in response, pointing out the irony in 𝗛𝐿's bravado. At that moment, 𝗛𝐿's eyes dulled, and he slowly pulled the headbands away from his neck at 𝗪𝐻𝐬's command. Izuku took a quick glance at the scoreboard and timer, noting that 𝗛𝐿's team was in 7th place with 5 minutes remaining. When he turned back, the headbands were already in the air but were intercepted by the front horse's quirk, hitting a wall of solid air and falling onto a second platform he had created just after the first. As the other team began to move, Izuku lowered his arm and pulled the quad blaster's trigger, shooting out another net that once again covered the rider and the front horse's head. Then came the moment of truth. With 𝗪𝐻𝐬's and 𝐼𝐻𝐬's words echoing in his mind, Izuku declared his intention to take 𝐼𝐻𝐬's quirk. As 𝐼𝐻𝐬 nodded, Izuku leaned down, placed a hand on his head, and activated his quirk. He aimed his breath at the air holding the headbands aloft. A layer of frost spread over it until the air itself turned to ice. Freezing it into a brittle sheet that shattered, Izuku reached up and jabbed the quad blaster through it. The headbands fell into his left hand, and he apologized to 𝐻𝐻𝐬 as he dropped the now useless gun to the ground, fastening the headbands around his neck. Before the front horse could create another air bubble, 𝐼𝐻𝐬 directed the team away. They moved to the outer edge of the field, stopping when they reached a section free from other teams. With their backs just meters from the line that determined the out-of-bounds area, they could focus on what lay ahead or to their sides. Izuku expressed his remorse once more, reaching down to return 𝐼𝐻𝐬's quirk. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 reassured him that it was fine. Izuku held back another apology, knowing it would only irritate 𝐼𝐻𝐬 further. He struggled to understand why 𝐼𝐻𝐬 was annoyed. Was it not better for Izuku to show his remorse, even if 𝐼𝐻𝐬 had permitted him to use his quirk? After all, using his quirk without an apology felt wrong. Shaking his head, Izuku checked the scoreboard and informed his team that they had 3.5 minutes left and were now in 4th place. Bakugo had finally surpassed Todoroki's team, which now occupied one of the last places with 0 points. Todoroki's team had moved closer to Izuku's team, engaging in a battle with Teeth Boy's team, who must have regained some points after losing them to Izuku's team. Just before Izuku turned his head, He heard someone from Todoroki's team shout about a powerful electric attack. A boy with electric blonde hair unleashed a wave of electricity while the others disappeared beneath what appeared to be an insulation sheet. The wave struck the opposing team, immobilizing them momentarily, and the boy smirked as his team charged forward. Bakugo's team remained on the same side of the field, much closer to Izuku's team than before. 𝐾𝐿 stated that they needed to defend until time ran out. Slightly to their left and a quarter of the way across the field, Bakugo leapt off the supporting hands of his team's horses and into the air. He propelled himself with explosions toward a four-person team Izuku didn't recognize. Landing on the front horse's shoulders, he swatted away the rider's hands with a smoking palm, grabbed the two headbands around the girl's neck, and blasted himself backward. One of the horses on Bakugo's team pointed his elbow at Bakugo's back, shooting out a piece of tape from his forearm to pull Bakugo back to safety. Izuku could only assume that Bakugo would do the same to them, making it even more personal than he had anticipated. Nevertheless, his plan should still work. Nothing had really changed. As Bakugo added two more headbands to the impressive collection around his neck, he flicked his gaze sideways and met Izuku's eyes. As their eyes locked, he raised a hand, causing an explosion to ignite in his palm, and flashed a grin. Izuku felt a tremor of fear as he realized Bakugo was approaching. 𝐼𝐮𝐲𝐸 confirmed that it wasn't just Bakugo they had to worry about. To their left stood a boy with 6 arms connected by fleshy webbing, his face obscured by a blue mask. His arms were positioned behind him, likely concealing another teammate. The boy accelerated towards them with astonishing speed. In an instant, something pink shot out from the gap between his arms, and Izuku barely had time to react before the iron spider's legs intercepted it. The projectile was deflected, hesitating for a moment before vanishing back into the shadows between the boy's arms. When it re-emerged, the iron spider met it above Izuku's head, where it ensnared one of its legs. The object was a long, slimy tongue, glistening with saliva that dripped onto the iron spider's metal surface. It became clear that one of the individuals concealed under the boy's arms possessed a quirk that extended their tongue, likely resembling that of a chameleon or frog. The tongue tugged at the spider leg it had ensnared, causing Izuku to nearly lose his balance as the pack jerked upward. If it continued to pull, he would fall, and his team wouldn't have time to regroup with Bakugo's team closing in. In a moment of determination, Izuku shrugged off the pack, allowing the tongue to pull it over his head and toss it aside. The pack hit the ground with a crunch, and Izuku winced at the sound of Hatsum's pained cry. They needed to move, but 𝐼𝐮𝐲𝐸 was stuck. Izuku couldn't see what had trapped 𝐼𝐮𝐲𝐸's foot, but he suspected it was the work of the boy with the webbed arms. As Webbed Arm Boy approached, 𝐾𝐿 unleashed another icy breath, seemingly more powerful than the last. Simultaneously, 𝐼𝐮𝐲𝐸 shouted at Webbed Arm Boy, but he ignored them, instead circling around Izuku's team and evading 𝐾𝐿's attack entirely. As he turned, he dropped his right arm, and the same tongue shot out before Izuku could see who had been revealed. It wrapped around his arm and yanked it back, forcing Izuku to extend his other hand to prevent himself from falling. He heard the sound of the headbands around his neck tearing. Before he could reclaim them, the tongue coiled around the headbands and pulled them back to the safety of Webbed Arm Boy's back. Although Tongue Person hadn't taken all of his headbands, enough had been lost. The scoreboard reflected their drop from 4th to 5th place, and as Webbed Arm Boy retreated, Present Mic announced that only 2 minutes remained. Bakugo's team was closing in. Izuku felt the pressure as he dug his fingernails into his palms. Bakugo launched himself into the air, and Izuku's arms froze in front of him, unable to protect the headbands they still had. If he tried to defend himself, Bakugo would be furious. He could only watch as Bakugo landed on 𝐾𝐿's shoulders and snatched the headbands from around his neck. Although Bakugo couldn't use his quirk to intentionally harm him due to the rules, Izuku braced himself for the heat that would come when Bakugo pressed a burning hand against his collarbone to push him backward. Once again, Bakugo was pulled back to his team by the 3 horses, who caught him and repositioned him on their hands. As Bakugo regained his balance, he let out a sharp laugh and declared that he wouldn't allow Izuku to cheat his way into the next round. Izuku bit the inside of his cheek, feeling the sting of defeat. He had devised a plan, and for what? 𝐾𝐞𝐭 attempted to unleash another icy breath at the front horse's feet, but it was weak and dissipated before reaching Bakugo. Present Mic announced that only 1 minute remained. 𝗪𝐻𝐸 called out to Bakugo, asking for the headbands back, but Bakugo didn't even glance in his direction. Instead, he grinned at the scoreboard, where Izuku's team had plummeted from 5th to 7th place, now at the bottom with 0 points. It couldn't end like this. Their victory had been so close. 𝗪𝐻𝐸 deserved a chance to make a name for himself. 𝐾𝐞𝐭 needed to prove that General Corps students could stand up to Hero Corps students, and 𝐼𝐻𝐸 had inventions to showcase. All 3 of them deserved to advance to the next round, and if Izuku could be the one to make that happen, he would. He could face Bakugo's wrath later, but that was a risk he was willing to take. Izuku shouted for his team to gather close. They hesitated for a moment before charging at Bakugo's team. Without warning, Izuku twisted around and slapped 𝗪𝐻𝐸 across the face. He then turned to Bakugo, his voice trembling as he declared that Bakugo was going to lose. Bakugo was taken aback, but he complied with Izuku's request to throw the 10 million point headband. Despite his teammates' protests, the headbands sailed through the air, and Izuku caught it with both hands, gripping the fabric with all his remaining strength. With shaking hands, he secured the band around his neck and fastened the Velcro strips together. Then, the buzzers sounded across the stadium, and Present Mic announced the end of the round. Izuku stared up at the press box in disbelief until 𝐻𝐸 cheered and released her grip on his foot, causing him to fall awkwardly to the ground. Present Mic exclaimed about the surprising turn of events, and Izuku heard 𝐒𝐻𝐸 groan into his microphone beside him. Team Midoriya had managed to reclaim first place, while Team Bakugo fell to 2nd, Team Todoroki to 3rd, and Team Monoma to 4th. Izuku hadn't had time to ask Bakugo to throw back the rest of their headbands, but this was enough. He immediately turned to 𝗪𝐻𝐸, apologizing for taking his quirk and for slapping him. He didn't respond, and Izuku knew he wouldn't, but he felt that if he said something he might get a reaction. Time was running out, and he hadn't even asked first. His voice trailed off, growing quieter until he muttered under his breath, a frown forming that threatened to strain his eyebrows. It was fine, he thought, though it had hurt. Izuku cringed, offering another apology, but the other boy was only joking, claiming he had barely felt it. Izuku gave 𝗪𝐻𝐸 a skeptical look at the poor attempt at humor but eventually let it go. After a warning, he transferred 𝗪𝐻𝐸's quirk back to him. 𝐾𝐞𝐭 expressed his surprise at their unexpected victory, complimenting Izuku. However, Bakugo stormed up to Izuku, teeth bared and palms smoking, causing Izuku to instinctively stiffen. He remained still, tilting his head back as Bakugo grabbed his shirt collar, knowing that showing fear would only make things worse. Accepting whatever Bakugo decided he deserved was often the best way to avoid more trouble, though sometimes Bakugo would cross a line, leaving Izuku with too many new scars. In those moments, a stuttered warning about not being able to move the next day was usually enough to make Bakugo back off, as he preferred not to involve Izuku's mother. As smoke filled the air, Izuku's mind conjured the unpleasant scent of burning. Bakugo's voice was harsh as he demanded to know what Izuku had done. If Izuku stayed silent, Bakugo's anger would only grow, so he forced himself to respond, stumbling over his words. 𝗪𝐻𝐸 interjected, coldly stating that he had borrowed his quirk, which Bakugo insisted was his business since it had been used on him. 𝗪𝐻𝐸, with a shadow cast over his eyes, simply replied that it was not Bakugo's concern. Bakugo laughed and leaned closer, needing to tilt his head slightly to meet 𝗪𝐻𝐸's gaze. He insisted it was his business, but 𝗪𝐻𝐸 remained unfazed, raising an eyebrow. The tension was palpable, and Izuku felt the urge to step in, to protect 𝗪𝐻𝐸 from Bakugo's wrath. He summoned all his strength to position himself between them, willing to take another hit rather than let Bakugo hurt 𝗪𝐻𝐸. Bakugo challenged them, questioning if they wanted to fight, while also taunting the possibility of disqualification. He glanced at Present Mic and 𝐒𝐻𝐸 in the press box, scoffing as he warned them not to lose before he could confront them himself. With a final glare at Izuku, he stomped back to his teammates, leaving 𝗪𝐻𝐸 to mutter an insult under his breath. Izuku dropped to his knees, oblivious to the pain, and rested a hand on his collarbone. His shirt was burned, the edges of the hole created by Bakugo's quirk thin and frayed. It was a small hole, but he could feel the twisted skin beneath. It was only a first-degree burn, though, and didn't hurt as much as usual. He hoped a teacher wouldn't notice, as that would lead to a trip to Recovery Girl, who would likely insist on examining his injuries. 𝗟𝐿 crouched down, asking if Izuku was all right. He inquired about the nickname Bakugo had for him, and Izuku humorlessly laughed, covering his face with his hands but leaving his fingers spread to see. 𝗟𝐿 remained silent, clearly waiting for more explanation, but Izuku didn't offer any. Eventually, 𝗟𝐿 suggested he should see Recovery Girl. Izuku shook his head vigorously, knowing that she wouldn't take his word for it this time. He didn't want to reveal the other scars he had, fearing it would lead to more questions. He insisted he was fine and that he needed to save his energy for the next round. 𝗟𝐿 stared at him, and Izuku squirmed under the scrutiny, but he held firm. Instead, he shifted the conversation, asking if they were okay. 𝗟𝐿 was confused, and Izuku explained that he could have taken the purple-haired girl's quirk. 𝗟𝐿 reassured him that they had won because of his quirk, but Izuku questioned if that was enough. 𝗟𝐿, rubbing the back of his neck, said he wouldn't push him, acknowledging he didn't know Izuku's past. Izuku subtly rubbed one of his older burn scars, the one that tingled the most. All his scars seemed to echo the pain they had once caused him, but this one was the most prominent, shaped like a handprint. He couldn't recall how he had received it or what he had done to deserve it, but the memory of the burning sensation lingered. He expressed his gratitude to 𝗟𝐿, who promised to listen if Izuku chose to share. As the first match approached, Izuku found himself among the two contestants. He wished he could analyze Miruko's fighting style, but 𝗟𝐿 preferred silence to focus. Instead, Izuku bounced his leg under the table, careful not to disturb anyone. He briefly regretted not bringing his hero analysis journal, knowing he should have anticipated this moment. Across from him, 𝗟𝐿 leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone without glancing up. Izuku felt grateful for that, as he was sure he looked terrible. They were the only two in the room, as everyone else in their class had already moved up to the stands to wait for the first match to begin. 𝗏𝐻𝐿 had also gone up to the stands after collecting a crumpled iron spider and a mostly intact quad blaster. After apologizing profusely, Izuku had asked her about the name of the quad blaster, hoping it would lift her spirits to discuss her invention. It did. The name paid homage to the 4 attempts it had taken her to perfect its design, during which the first 3 attempts had resulted in the gun malfunctioning. Izuku was uncertain why 𝗟𝐿 was sitting with him. He suspected that 𝗟𝐿 was there to provide comfort simply by being present, but since Izuku felt he couldn't do much with him around, it wasn't very reassuring. He couldn't think of another reason for 𝗟𝐿's presence, especially since he knew 𝗟𝐿 wanted to watch the other competitors fight. Izuku folded his arms on the table and rested his head on them, his leg bouncing nervously. He wouldn't need to fight Bakugo unless he won the first 2 matches. But if he won those matches, facing Bakugo would be inevitable. Of course, he could always forfeit and give his position to a member of the team that ranked 5th in the second event. However, that would feel like admitting he was unworthy of transferring. If he gave up now, they would assume one of 2 things: either he believed he had proven himself enough and felt above continuing, or he was afraid of battling the Hero Corps students who could one day become his classmates. Even if he pretended to be ill, who would believe him? Not to mention that going to Recovery Girl could lead to her examining him for injuries from the previous events. But at least that was uncertain. If he did fight Bakugo, he would likely leave with a few new burns. Recovery Girl would see those, along with the older scars on his shoulders, some of which were still fresh. She would know, and then his mother would know, and then everyone would know, and they couldn't know. If he threw one of his first 2 matches, Bakugo would see right through his act, no matter how well Izuku performed, and he would have to face the consequences. While he might be able to avoid visiting Recovery Girl, that wouldn't change the fact that Bakugo would leave more scars in his wake. Izuku had hoped he would never have to endure that again. He had finally been freed from junior high. 𝐻𝐬 was supposed to be different. It was meant to be a place where nobody knew his quirk, where Bakugo wasn't a constant threat sitting just a few seats in front of him. At least, not for a while. Had he asked for too much? Suddenly, 𝗟𝐿 stood up, kicking his feet off the table and pushing his chair back under it. He paused between the table and the doorway, asking if Izuku wanted to borrow his quirk. The word borrow was something Izuku hadn't heard used before to describe his quirk, and he knew 𝐻𝐮𝐲 had chosen it intentionally. That alone made Izuku smile slightly. However, that couldn't stop his expression from falling again. If he took 𝐻𝐮𝐲's quirk, winning against Shiozaki, Todoroki, or 𝗟𝗏 could become much easier, which was exactly what he wanted to avoid. He hesitated, saying it was okay. If he wanted to take Shiozaki's quirk, he shouldn't take 𝐻𝐮𝐲's as well. He had never tried taking two quirks at the same time, so he wasn't sure if he could even do it. The lie tasted bitter, but it was a truth nonetheless, just not the one he was using to justify his decision. 𝗫𝐮𝐲 nodded and opened the door, wishing him good luck. Izuku managed a strained smile as the door swung shut behind 𝗫𝐮𝐲. With him gone, Izuku didn't have to maintain his composure anymore. He stood up with enough force to knock his chair backward and began pacing in circles around the waiting room, mumbling to himself. There was always a chance he could lose one of the first two matches while genuinely trying to win. Especially against Todoroki, who was easily one of the strongest students in the first-year hero course. Todoroki could defeat him without even moving, as long as Izuku never got a chance to use his quirk. 𝗟𝗏 could do the same. With his tape, he could swing Izuku out of bounds before he got close enough to touch him. If he entered the arena, he would need to use his quirk. There was no point in participating in the third event if he wasn't going to use it. The only option that wouldn't lead to Recovery Girl discovering his scars and wouldn't leave his skin burned was to forfeit before the third event began. He could pretend to be ill. He could even force himself to vomit to make it believable. With that, there was a chance they would believe him. Maybe his performance in the second event would be enough for the hero course teachers. All he had to do was insist to Recovery Girl that he was only bruised otherwise and escape her office right after. She wouldn't need to know. Bakugo would see through the act, but if it kept his scars hidden, Izuku would have to take the chance. Besides, whether he stayed in Recovery Girl's office or was sent home, Bakugo wouldn't be able to attack him for a little while. With that decision made, Izuku moved to the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. Just as he was about to grip it, the door handle turned. Izuku jumped back, leaning to the side to peek around the door, and was met with All Might's towering figure as he squeezed through the doorway. Once inside, All Might stood up straight, his head nearly brushing the ceiling, and placed his hands on his hips. All Might was there to ask him why he hadn't taken the hero course entrance exam. It was a bit late for that, but perhaps this was the first chance he had to talk to Izuku alone without drawing unwanted attention. Maybe he had been looking for an opportunity to do so since the school year began. He greeted Izuku warmly, expressing his gladness to see him doing well. Izuku's performance in the last event was creating quite a buzz in the stands. He wondered if the audience was impressed or horrified, leaning towards the latter. However, All Might's enthusiasm suggested otherwise. All Might let out a hearty laugh, assuring Izuku that his fellow teachers were discussing him, and it was all positive. Izuku's curiosity turned to concern as he asked about 𝗫𝐮𝐲, wanting to know if he was also being talked about. All Might recalled a purple-haired classmate and mentioned that 𝗟𝗏 had mentioned two students considering a transfer, but his focus had been on Izuku. He expressed surprise that Izuku hadn't taken the hero course's entrance exam. Izuku felt a pang of guilt as he explained that he couldn't take the exam if it meant taking away other examinees' quirks. He couldn't bear to ruin their dreams. All Might understood, acknowledging that Izuku's decision was commendable. Izuku's anxiety returned as he pressed for information about 𝗫𝐮𝐲's chances. All Might reassured him that 𝗫𝐮𝐲 was indeed being discussed and that strong performances in the event would lead to rewards for both of them. Izuku realized he hadn't made enough of an impression yet. He contemplated faking an illness to convince the teachers that he couldn't continue, hoping they would extrapolate from his previous performance. But deep down, he knew he had to face the challenge ahead. All Might encouraged him to give a great performance, patting him on the shoulder. Izuku accepted the gesture, feeling a mix of determination and fear. All Might wished him luck and left to return to the stands. Izuku felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He couldn't forfeit after hearing All Might's words. He was on the verge of disappointing everyone again by escaping out of fear. He knew the hero course teachers were waiting to make a decision, and if he wanted it to be in his favor, he had to step up. As Present Mix's voice echoed through the stadium, Izuku opened the door with hesitant fingers, praying that one of his opponents would be stronger than him. He walked forward, wringing his hands and scanning his surroundings. The arena was impressive, with a tiered concrete stage set up for the matches, likely constructed by 𝐼𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐻 on short notice. The stage was positioned in the center of the stadium, surrounded by raised stone bowls with flames flickering at the edges. Though the fire was intimidating, they were far enough away that he wouldn't have to smell the smoke. As Izuku stepped into the sunlight, the crowd's cheers grew louder, and he hoped they weren't for him. Soon, they would discover what his quirk was, and he knew there would be no hiding it. He could only hope they would see him as a student from the most reputable hero school, with no intention of causing harm. Above him, the stadium screen displayed a picture of him taken the day before, and he felt embarrassed by how he looked. 𝗟𝐮𝐲, standing on the other side of the stage, appeared calm and collected, contrasting Izuku's nerves. Present Mic announced their arrivals, his voice booming throughout the stadium. Izuku forced himself into a fighting stance, despite the urge to check his pulse. His legs felt weak, and the burn scars on his skin tingled. Across the stage, Shiozaki watched him, her vine-like hair floating gracefully around her head, each strand adorned with thorns. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, as if in prayer. Izuku knew he had to win the match to avoid disappointing All Might and the hero course teachers. He needed to find a way to convincingly lose the next match, assuming he could win this one. His best strategy was to catch her vines. If he succeeded, he could take her quirk. He hoped her hair contained her DNA, as that would determine his chances of winning. There was a small possibility she might know about his quirk from her classmates. But the only one who truly understood what had happened was Bakugo, who would never admit to being bested. Izuku considered testing the theory by speaking, knowing that one of Bakugo's teammates might have noticed that his brainwashing only activated after Bakugo responded to him. If they had informed Shiozaki, she would have refused to respond. Izuku called out, hoping to sound more confident, though his voice came out strained. Talking was often unnecessarily difficult. Shiozaki narrowed her eyes at him, remaining silent and pursing her lips. Bakugo's teammates had misinformed her, and Izuku almost wished their deduction had been correct. The match began, and a writhing swarm of vines filled Izuku's vision. He had anticipated this and narrowly escaped by diving to the side and rolling before springing back up. As the vines pursued him, he prepared himself. He threw his arms up just in time as the vines wrapped around his forearms, thorns pricking his skin without breaking it. However, when they jerked forward, he stumbled along with them. Blood trickled from the scratches, but they were minor injuries. The vines tugged again, trying to pin his arms to his sides and push him out of bounds. Struggling against their strength, he pushed against them, inching closer to his other arm. With a final burst of determination, he pressed his palm against the bundle of vines. He activated his quirk, feeling the pressure in his jaw as he did so. The vines that had cut off his circulation vanished, retracting back to Shiozaki. As they shrank, they transformed into dark green hair that cascaded down her back. She stared at a lock of hair in her hand, her expression shifting from horror to confusion, then back to horror as she realized her means of defense had been taken from her. Apologizing again, Izuku extended a few vines from both sides of his head, attempting to control them. He knew that using them could risk injuring Shiozaki, and he hesitated. Even though the teachers would prefer him to use his quirk effectively, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He hoped they would understand his reasoning. Long-range quirk users often struggled in close combat, and Izuku aimed to take advantage of that. He doubted Shiozaki had much experience in close-quarters fighting, especially as a first-year hero student still learning to use her quirk. Izuku, however, had a solid grasp of combat techniques, and he hoped his skills would impress the teachers. He charged toward Shiozaki, feeling the thorns on the short vines near his face prick his forehead. When he reached her, she was the first to strike, throwing a punch that grazed his cheek. Izuku pressed forward, refusing to back down, pushing her toward the white line that would secure his victory. As they moved, Shiozaki mostly dodged, occasionally launching counterattacks that Izuku managed to block. It was clear she lacked practical training in close-range combat. Realizing his strategy, Shiozaki shifted to offense. However, the line was close behind her, and her attacks lacked the power of a seasoned fighter. Even when she managed to land a blow, it lacked force. Izuku took the opportunity to counterattack, ensuring his form remained as perfect as possible. She threw a wide punch, and Izuku caught it as he had done many times before. With one hand around her wrist and the other on her upper arm, he ducked under her arm and used his shoulder to guide her over his shoulder, carefully controlling her descent. Her foot crossed the line, and he released her, stepping back. While he couldn't claim the match had been impressive, it would suffice. He knew he wouldn't win the next match, especially since Todoroki was expected to be the festival's champion. It was only natural for an inexperienced general course student to lose against the son of the number 2 hero. Midnight announced that Shiozaki had gone out of bounds, declaring Izuku the winner. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Izuku frowned as he looked up at the stands. He couldn't believe they were cheering for him after he had revealed his quirk so clearly. Were they celebrating the end of the match? Turning back to Shiozaki, who had yet to rise, he wrestled with whether to offer her a hand. It was a polite gesture, but he had just taken her quirk. She might not want to touch him. Ultimately, he extended his hand, allowing her the choice to refuse. She accepted it with a small but grateful smile, which surprised him. He expressed his regret for taking her quirk, offering to return it immediately. She looked confused but held out her arm. He transferred it back, apologizing once more. She reassured him that it was all right, then bowed despite knowing what had just happened. She thanked him for a fair match. Izuku responded awkwardly, acknowledging her gesture. She nodded and turned to leave, heading back down the stairs she had come from. After taking one last glance at her, Izuku decided to walk down a different set of stairs. He wanted to avoid the awkwardness of descending the same flight together, so he took the longer route to Class 1C section in the stands, buying himself some time. He knew he would have to face his classmates soon, and he wondered what they would think of him now. Eventually, Izuku entered their section. 𝗟𝐿 had chosen to sit in the front row, the farthest from the only exit. At least he had distanced himself from the rest of the class, who were gathered closely behind, leaving an empty row in between. This arrangement made it easy for them to confront Izuku before he could react. Now that his classmates knew about his quirk, the potential for conflict was there. But he questioned who, besides Bakugo, would approach him now that they were aware of it. This thought led him to wonder about his future interactions with his classmates. Would they recreate the uncomfortable atmosphere of junior high? He recalled moments of sitting at a desk with a red spider lily on it, skipping lunch to avoid confrontation, and planning his responses to minimize his discomfort. No, he couldn't dwell on that now, not with so many people around and without the comfort of his own room, or perhaps without his trusty 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 knife. Izuku hesitated for a moment, considering whether 𝗟𝐿 would mind if he chose to sit with an empty seat between them. After some thought, he decided to place an empty chair between them, opting to sit at the edge of the row. He acknowledged 𝗟𝐿's comment about his picture, feeling a bit defensive about his nervousness. 𝗟𝐿 dismissed the need for luck, and although Izuku smiled, he felt the awkwardness of the moment. As Todoroki and 𝗟𝐿 made their way to the stage, Izuku checked his pulse absent-mindedly, glancing around to ensure no one in their section had moved. From their distance, it was impossible to hear the competitors, and the screen had not yet switched to the video feed from the stage. At least the screen was positioned on the opposite side of the stadium, providing a clear view for you, students. Izuku assumed this was intentional. Todoroki stood still after reaching the top of the stairs, crossing the white line that marked the out-of-bounds area. 𝗟𝐿 was stretching his arms, seemingly muttering to himself about President Mick's earlier comments. The commentary felt a bit insensitive. As the match began, 𝗟𝐿 launched 2 strips of tape that wrapped around Todoroki's waist. He cut one of the strips and attempted to swing Todoroki aside. Just before Todoroki could cross the line, he created a wall of ice that he slammed into. Without hesitation, he swept his arm through the air, launching a line of ice that expanded rapidly. By the time it reached 𝗟𝐿, It had encased his body below the neck in ice. But the ice didn't stop there. It surged upward, extinguishing the flames around the stage and spiraling toward the stands, carefully avoiding any spectators. It continued until it formed massive spikes that jutted out over the roofline, covering nearly half of the stadium. This display of power was something Izuku never expected to overcome. Izuku turned to 𝗏𝐿, who noted his excitement. Flustered, Izuku denied it, but 𝗏𝐿 seemed unconvinced. As Todoroki began melting the ice away from 𝗏𝐿, Izuku noticed it was the first time Todoroki had utilized his left side. Once 𝗏𝐿 was free, Todoroki silently walked down the stairs, avoiding eye contact with his father, 𝗟𝗏, who watched him intently. It was unclear whether 𝗟𝗏's unpleasant demeanor had caused their strained relationship or if there was something deeper at play. 15 minutes passed as 𝗟𝗏 carefully melted the glacier without endangering the audience, though many spectators had already left during the intermission. Izuku pondered why Todoroki hadn't assisted in melting the ice. It seemed a bit rude, but perhaps he had his reasons. He clearly wanted to avoid his father, but maybe he had decided to leave before noticing him. Or perhaps he wanted to make a statement by refusing to help. Once the ice was cleared and the crowd returned, President Mike called for the next competitors. Bakugo ascended the stage with a scowl, while 𝗏𝗚 approached with an overabundance of confidence for her opponent. Regardless of her impressive inventions, they would be no match for Bakugo. Bakugo was not one to hold back, even against a girl. Izuku wished he could believe Bakugo would recognize 𝗏𝗚's lack of threat and conserve his energy for the next match. If 𝗏𝗚 was lucky, she might be knocked out of bounds by one of Bakugo's opening explosions. If not, she would likely leave with injuries similar to Izuku's. Feeling overwhelmed, Izuku stood up, muttering something about needing to use the bathroom before quickly exiting their section. The hallway was brightly lit and, fortunately, as empty as the lower-level corridors of the stadium had been. The sound of an explosion echoed through the concrete walls, causing the floor to shake beneath him. He quickened his pace and turned the corner. In the bathroom, damp and cold as public restrooms often are, Izuku locked himself in a stall and sat on the Western-style toilet. Despite his surroundings, he felt more comfortable than he had since arriving home the previous night. Since he was 8 years old, he had always found solace in the cold, which was why winter was his favorite season. Resting his elbows on his knees, he closed his eyes, allowing them to rest for perhaps the first time since waking up that day. His hands were cold, so he pressed them against his cheeks until they warmed up. Though the bathroom was silent, the distant rumbles of Bakugo's explosions were impossible to ignore. He moved his hands from his cheeks to cover his ears. He remained still until he heard cheers from the crowd drift inside. If the cheers were loud enough to hear, the match must have ended or a new one had started. After waiting a few more seconds, he resolved to return to Class 1C section before Bakugo could walk down the same hallway he needed to use. If those cheers had indeed signaled the end of the match, Bakugo should have already returned to his seat. Izuku rushed through the hallway without encountering any obstacles, thankfully. Slipping through the doorway, he made his way back to his seat as cautiously as possible. The cheers must have been for the conclusion of Bakugo and 𝗏𝗚's match, as the stage was empty. Next up was 𝗟𝗏 and 𝗏𝗏's match. They faced each other, both crouching as they awaited present mix signal. Their match concluded rather quickly. Up in the air, 𝗏𝗏 could do nothing but wait for midnight to declare him immobilized and for 𝗟𝗏 to release him. If only they could have both lost somehow. Now 𝗟𝗏 had to face Bakugo in the next round. When their match ended, 𝗏𝐿 stood up. Izuku wished him luck as he turned to leave. His match was against Kirishima, a boy from Class 1A whom he could easily defeat if he managed to make him talk before the match began. If not, their match would turn into an endurance contest that 𝗏𝐿 would likely lose. Gritting his teeth, Izuku willed himself to focus on the upcoming match. While the screen wouldn't switch to video feed until President Mike started the match, Izuku could see 𝗏𝐿's mouth moving. Kirishima's back was turned, so Izuku couldn't tell if he was responding. However, 𝗏𝐿 showed no signs of desperation, no forward movement, no widening of his mouth to yell, no hand gestures indicating sudden anxiety. 𝗏𝐿 didn't even open his mouth again. He had already won. When the match began, neither 𝐼𝐮𝐲 nor Kirishima moved at first. But after a few seconds, Kirishima turned around and stepped out of bounds. As he walked, Present Mic explained 𝐼𝐮𝐲's quirk. Like Izuku, he only described the basics, omitting any specific details that could jeopardize the quirk user's chances in future matches. When Midnight announced 𝐼𝐮𝐲's victory, the crowd matched Present Mic's enthusiasm. Although Izuku lacked the confidence to join in the cheers, he did clap. The next match featured Kirano and 𝗟𝗡𝐿, the boy whose quirk could solidify air. Their match lasted longer than any previous ones, but not by much. Kirano secured the win with a decisive kick that sent 𝗟𝗡𝐿 sprawling out of bounds. Following that, a Class 1A student faced a Class 1B student, 𝐻𝗎𝐻𝐸 and 𝗟𝗏𝐻𝐸. After a few minutes of back and forth, 𝐻𝗎𝐻𝐸 managed to immobilize 𝗟𝗏𝐻𝐸 with cuffs around his wrists and ankles. The final match was between Monoma and Kaminari, the blonde boy with the electric-type quirk. Kaminari attacked first when the match began, yelling about a massive voltage before unleashing a burst of lightning toward Monoma. Simultaneously, Monoma's pale blonde hair transformed into vines that detached from his scalp to form a protective wall. The lightning struck it and dissipated, leaving Monoma unharmed and Kaminari short-circuited. Present Mic then explained the side effect of using too much electricity. Kaminari lost intelligence after using his quirk. Izuku found that strange. He had never heard of such a drawback before. More importantly, however, was Monoma's hair. Present Mic soon revealed that his quirk was named 𝗏𝗏. It wasn't like Izuku's quirk, not really. Shoulders sagging, Izuku sank back into his seat, refusing to meet 𝐼𝐮𝐲's gaze, which he felt on his face. Pushing his fingernails into his side, where his shirt concealed the marks and where 𝐼𝐮𝐲 wouldn't see, Izuku forced himself to refocus on the festival. Present Mic announced the end of the first matches. Izuku was almost certain that Todoroki would rely solely on his right side during their match, though he had little understanding of why. Not that the reason mattered at the moment. From what Izuku had observed, Todoroki needed to first create a narrow trail of ice before it could develop into the formidable attack that had nearly frozen the audience. Izuku wasn't sure if Todoroki could use ice for close-range combat as well. He certainly seemed to prefer keeping his opponents at a distance. Therefore, if Izuku wanted to lose, he needed to remain on his side of the stage. If he managed to get close enough to Todoroki, he could take his quirk, and if he took Todoroki's quirk, he couldn't lose without revealing his intentions. If he won, there was no way he could triumph in the next match. There was no way he could conceal his scars. No way he could leave without reliving what he thought he had finally escaped. If he won, the hero course teachers would realize he wasn't fit to be a hero, and All Might would see it, and the audience would too. They would all understand that he was pathetic. Perhaps that was better than them believing he was destined to be a villain. But they needed to see that he could be a hero, and of the options available to him, losing here was the only outcome that might yield what he desired. Unless Bakugo had already convinced the hero course teachers of that. He could have mentioned how worthless Izuku was, how he was less than worthless, how everyone had despised him and wanted him to disappear so he wouldn't become a thief or a killer. But if Bakugo had already persuaded them, All Might wouldn't have told him that the hero course teachers saw potential in him. Unless All Might had been lying to spare his feelings, but why would All Might seek him out just to lie when he could have stayed away? People tended to avoid lying unless pushed into it by unavoidable circumstances. The hero course teachers knew his quirk, and they had known it since the first event. Yet All Might had said they were genuinely considering him. Perhaps that even included Eraserhead. Eraserhead could see the similarities between himself and Izuku, and perhaps others could look beyond Izuku's quirk. Even if they couldn't, and they were merely concerned about what he might become if they denied him a chance, he could still prove himself in time. So, Izuku still had a chance, even if he lost the match. As Izuku reached the last step of the stairs, he hesitated. If he intentionally lost, Todoroki would advance to face Bakugo. How could Izuku do that to him? Todoroki was the one who was accustomed to pain, the scent of smoke and burnt sugar lingering in the air. The scars on his skin, no matter how well he cared for them, never faded completely. He was the one who could endure the pain, And he was the one who should. What was one more scar on his body? What right did he have to prioritize his own safety over Todoroki's? Wouldn't that make him as terrible as a villain? No, he had to confront Todoroki with all the strength and strategy he possessed, and he would strive to win. As he took his place on the stage, the cheers of the crowd barely registered in his mind. Izuku wished his match would come later. He wished he had brought his first aid kit filled with gauze and bandages. He wished he could lock himself in the bathroom and emerge with a clearer mind. He wished he had the foresight to only harm his thighs instead of his shoulders, as those would be less likely for Recovery Girl to discover. Why was he so foolish? Todoroki's expression was neutral, neither bored nor particularly interested. His narrowed eyes remained fixed on Izuku, making him squirm. It wasn't a glare, it was more analytical than malicious. It was nothing like the stares he had received from his classmates in junior high, which had been far more painful. Although images of Todoroki were easily found online, they failed to capture the true details of his face. Both of his eyes appeared lighter in the sunlight, his blue eye reminiscent of the sea in summer and his gray eye resembling a storm cloud in spring. The patch of burned skin surrounding his left eye was more pronounced, red and mostly smooth. It was entirely different from Izuku's own scars, which were pink, silver, and uneven. How had he acquired it? Had it hurt as much as Izuku's injuries? Given its location, Izuku guessed it must have been more painful than any of his own. It was peculiar how Todoroki never attempted to hide his scar, never used makeup or grew out his hair to cover it, as Izuku surely would have. That confidence was admirable. Averting his gaze, Izuku hoped Todoroki hadn't noticed his staring. In the comfort of the press box, Present Mic introduced them once more, keeping their introductions largely the same. They both took their positions. Present Mic called for the match to begin. Izuku barely had time to catch his breath before a wave of ice surged toward him. As it spread across the stage, he could only describe the sound as the noise of shimmering ice. He launched himself to the side, breaking into a run, glancing back to see his previous position transformed into a puzzle of glittering spikes. His legs protested as he sprinted alongside the trail of ice forming on the ground. Another wave came hurtling toward him, much faster than the first. Izuku forced himself to leap out of the way but stumbled upon landing, bracing himself against the ground to avoid falling. Todoroki's hand swept out for a third attack, prompting Izuku to dive into a roll to the side. When he jumped up, he noticed ice had formed on the back of his left shoe and up his breathed leg. The cold bit into his skin, but he kept moving, grateful that the ice broke away. Todoroki raised his right hand again, and Izuku knew another attack was imminent. He was just an arm's length away from Todoroki, so he stretched out his hand, fingers splayed and palm facing down. He felt his fingertips make contact, but his palm never connected. Just as he reached Todoroki's skin, his own hand became encased in ice. Todoroki stepped back, exhaling a small cloud of icy breath. Without Todoroki there to stabilize him, Izuku tipped forward, but his face never met the ground. His feet were trapped in a thick block of ice that crept up to his calves, biting into his exposed skin. His right hand was also encased in ice, the jagged edges ending in the middle of his forearm. A chilling sensation crept up beyond where the ice stopped, numbing his skin. Izuku found he didn't mind at all. Though his left hand was free, Todoroki had retreated far enough to ensure Izuku had no hope of reaching him. Midnight declared Todoroki the winner, emphasizing her point with a crack of her WHP. Todoroki sighed, and it almost sounded like disappointment. Izuku wondered if it was because their match ended so quickly or if Todoroki had wanted a greater challenge. But he would face more of a fight in the upcoming matches, and that was Izuku's doing. Izuku expressed his regret, feeling the weight of his failure. Todoroki, in a monotone voice, asked what he was apologizing for. He stepped closer to Izuku, placing his left hand on the ice surrounding Izuku's arm. Izuku fought the urge to flinch away as the ice melted, water sliding down his arm and dripping onto the ground. Todoroki then moved to melt the ice around Izuku's feet. Holding his arm away to prevent water from dripping onto Todoroki, Izuku watched his hand, bracing for an unexpected attack. Izuku apologized again for losing. Todoroki reassured him that he had tried, and that was what mattered. Standing up, Todoroki completed his task. Izuku stepped out of the puddle created by the melted ice, his shoes now soaked with cold water. He shivered, rubbing his wet arm against his shirt to dry it off. Todoroki reached out slowly, placing his hand against Izuku's arm. Izuku jolted at the touch and the warmth radiating from it, but Todoroki remained steady, likely anticipating such a reaction from the sudden change in temperature. Izuku locked his arm in place, appreciating the pleasant warmth as Todoroki simply aimed to help. Izuku was aware of the heat against his skin, and as soon as he felt it, he quickly pulled his arm back, causing Todoroki to look at him with confusion and a hint of offense. Izuku apologized, feeling awkward about his sudden movement. Todoroki nodded, albeit awkwardly, and began to walk away, but Izuku called out to him before he could get too far. He asked if Todoroki could fight Bakugo, to which Todoroki's confusion was evident. He stated that he had to. Izuku suggested that Todoroki should utilize his fire as well, explaining that it could counter Bakugo's quirk. Bakugo's hands produced a substance similar to nitroglycerin, which would explode when exposed to sudden heat. Izuku believed Todoroki could use his fire to turn Bakugo's quirk against him. However, Todoroki simply replied that he couldn't. Izuku realized it wasn't his place to press the issue, but he thought that if Todoroki wanted to avoid the scars that marked Izuku, he would need to ℟𝐼𝐴 all his abilities. Even though Todoroki's left side was resistant to fire, Bakugo would likely target the side where he could inflict the most damage. Izuku pondered why Todoroki was reluctant to use his fire, considering it was a part of him, not just a reflection of his father's quirk. It seemed that Todoroki's relationship with his father was complicated, and his refusal to use his fire was a form of rebellion. Izuku didn't have much experience with father-son relationships, but he understood that Todoroki's situation was unique. While many teenagers rebel against their parents, Todoroki's struggle seemed more profound. He had managed to reach the semi-finals of the event using only half of his quirk, while others like ♯and Izuku had to rely on their full powers just to keep up. Izuku recognized that Todoroki's suppression of his fire side was a burden he had taken upon himself without a valid reason, and he wondered how much stress that caused him. Midnight called out to Izuku, reminding him to visit Recovery Girl to check for any ice burns. Izuku acknowledged her and watched as Todoroki's distinctive hair disappeared down the stairs, choosing not to follow. Izuku returned only after Bakugo and 𝗟𝗏𝐼𝐴's match had concluded. He spotted Hitoshi as he left the stands for his own match. Hitoshi noticed Izuku leaning against the wall, looking around nervously. He appeared to be making a face that suggested discomfort. Hitoshi inquired about the expression, but Izuku seemed unaware of it. Hitoshi pressed on, questioning if Izuku had been present the entire time. Izuku explained that Midnight had sent him to see Recovery Girl, which had taken longer than expected. Hitoshi was skeptical, sensing that Izuku was avoiding the truth. He decided he would need to persuade Izuku to visit Recovery Girl after the festival. Hitoshi shifted the conversation, asking if Izuku was ready for his match. Izuku expressed hope for victory, and Hitoshi waved goodbye as he turned to leave. Hitoshi had seen enough to know that Izuku was struggling. He noticed how Izuku would isolate himself during physical education, avoiding showing his bruises, and how he would sit as far away as possible from others during lunch. Hitoshi also recognized that Izuku would conveniently disappear whenever Bakugo was fighting. Despite Izuku's claims of being jumpy, Hitoshi understood there was more to it, but he refrained from asking, knowing Izuku would likely not share the truth. Hitoshi felt a strong longing to help Izuku. Unlike the bullies from his past, Izuku had faced challenges that came with having a villainous quirk, and Hitoshi knew those experiences were far more difficult than his own. Izuku had been the first to respond positively to Hitoshi's quirk, affirming its potential for heroism when others had dismissed it. Hitoshi was determined to assist Izuku, even if it meant confronting Bakugo. He imagined a scenario where he could turn Bakugo's own explosive abilities against him, relishing the thought of putting him in his place. However, his immediate focus was on winning his upcoming matches, one after another. If he reached the finals, he would face either Bakugo or Todoroki, both of whom were destined to be top heroes. Hitoshi hoped to take down 𝗏𝗏𝐸, but he wouldn't mind defeating Todoroki after besting 𝗏𝗏𝐸. To have a chance at that, Hitoshi needed to win against the wolf girl in his next match. As he walked through the dim hallway and stepped into the bright sunlight, he glared at the cheering crowd, feeling frustrated that they were safe in the stands while he fought. He hoped the teachers in the hero course were paying attention to his quirk and recognizing its potential. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, his legs burned from the exertion. He couldn't help but wonder why there had to be so many steps. 𝐮𝐸𝐽𝐻 seemed to take pleasure in watching them struggle from the comfort of his chair, which was made of cement. Hitoshi thought it was only fair that he should endure a bit of discomfort too. After all, 𝐮𝐸𝐽𝐻 was practically made of the stuff himself. Hitoshi wished that a stray attack from one of their matches would give him a good bump on his blocky head. It would be amusing, albeit in a terrible way. Across from him, Kirano was warming up, stretching her arms and bouncing lightly on her furry feet. Hitoshi decided to follow her lead. Midoriya had mentioned knowing her, but since Hitoshi hadn't taken the hero course entrance exam, he had no idea how they had met. Perhaps they were acquainted from outside 𝑢. He could ask later. For now, he had a wolf girl to tease. It had been surprisingly easy to manipulate the guy with the shark teeth. A simple comment about how he and his teammates had relied on someone strong like 𝗏𝗏𝐸 to pass the second round had done the trick. Most people became defensive when someone insulted them or their friends, especially self-righteous hero course students who took their quirks for granted. Hitoshi would certainly be upset if someone spoke ill of Midoriya, even if Midoriya sometimes chose not to use his quirk. But individuals like the Shark Kid didn't insult or ignore people like Hitoshi and Midoriya, they pitted them instead. Hitoshi would show them exactly where they could put that pity. He cracked his knuckles, enjoying the satisfying sound, and wondered if 𝗏𝗏𝐸 was just there to prove they were better than one. Kirano pursed her lips, and Hitoshi couldn't help but laugh. He had anticipated her reaction. Present Mic began the match, and the wolf girl wasted no time. She charged at him, reaching out to grab his wrist. Hitoshi quickly jerked away and jumped back, raising both fists in front of his jaw, taunting her about her speed. This time, she opened her mouth but didn't speak. Instead, she bared her teeth and lunged again, moving faster than before. Hitoshi couldn't dodge in time, so he braced himself and forced his arms up to block her kick. The impact sent a sharp pain through his forearms, and he stumbled backward from the force. That girl had some serious strength. He rolled backward over his shoulder, just as Midoriya had taught him weeks ago. It wasn't perfect, and he didn't have enough momentum to spring back up. The wolf girl nearly stomped on him, but he managed to push himself out of the way with one hand. His temple grazed the ground as he flipped over, but he forced himself to stand. Wincing, he kept one eye on her. He wondered if all hero course students were so eager to prove themselves or if it was just her. She threw another kick at his head, and he ducked under it, preparing to jab her in the side. But then she turned and kicked backward, her knee bent to hook around his throat. It was a move he had attempted once and never tried again due to the strain it had caused. Hitoshi raised his arm to protect his head and took the hit. His shoes slipped on the ground as he was pushed back, but he didn't fall this time. Instead, he landed a solid punch to her exposed side. She doubled over, letting out a sound that resembled a growl. With her hunched over, he couldn't execute a throw, so he went for another punch. It was more of a haymaker, but it connected with the side of her head, causing her to stumble. She didn't fall, but her momentary falter gave him enough time to back away. He cradled his fist for a moment, feeling his knuckles throb, then brought both hands back to his chin. He complimented her on her performance, noting that he was impressed. She shot him a half-smile, half-glare that didn't intimidate him. Hitoshi decided to take the initiative. He kept his fists close to his face, ready to block any incoming attacks. He knew he couldn't telegraph his moves, the wolf girl was too quick for that. When she initiated a punch, he dropped to the ground to evade her sight and attempted to sweep her leg out from under her. Just before he made contact, she hopped over his leg, maintaining her balance. She executed a powerful axe kick, and Hitoshi barely had time to scramble away. Her heels struck the ground, cracking the cement. He quickly regained his footing and aimed a left jab at her nose. Just before it connected, She intercepted his fist with her palm, curling her fingers around his hand. Her grip was strong, and he felt the pressure on his skin. If she continued to tighten her hold, she could injure his hand. Hitoshi clenched his teeth to suppress any sounds of discomfort. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing it hurt. When he threw a punch with his other hand, she gripped that fist just as tightly. He swore he could hear his bones creaking. With narrowed eyes, he challenged her to keep going. She grinned and complied, following his instructions to step over the white line to her left, albeit at a painfully slow pace. It didn't matter, he knew he had already won. He shook out his hands, frowning at how stiff they felt. He would need to see Recovery Girl after the day was over, but not before. Doing so would mean losing the little energy he had left. For once, he had managed to get a decent night's sleep, but that didn't erase years of waking up multiple times before his alarm. Present Mike announced his victory, and the crowd erupted in cheers. They seemed more enthusiastic for him than they had been for Midoriya. It was amusing how they didn't care about his quirk as long as he only manipulated other contestants. Hitoshi knew better than to think this fight would change their perception of him. He would bet his stash of medium roast coffee that they would still hesitate if he asked them what time it was. Despite the cheers, he felt a twinge of frustration. Midoriya was foolish for wanting to be a typical pro. Why not aim to be an underground hero like him? It would be much simpler to stay out of the spotlight and avoid the judgment of those who assumed he would turn to the dark side with the right bribe. When he had asked, Midoriya expressed his longing to become a hero who could demonstrate that no quirk was inherently villainous. This perspective made sense, especially since underground heroes struggled to change public perception. However, Hitoshi doubted that people's minds would change easily or often. He glanced at the wolf girl, who stood silently at the edge of the crowd, seemingly lost in thought. After releasing his hold on her mind, Hitoshi stuffed his thumbs into his pockets and made his way to the stairs, feeling the throb in his hands. The cool shade of the hall was a relief. He turned right and approached the first door on his left. Before heading up, he paused at the water fountain, enjoying the refreshing taste of the water. As he ascended the stairs two at a time, he dried his hands on his breathes, stopping midway to catch his breath. He realized he needed to improve his endurance if that brief encounter had left him winded. Confrontations with villains, whether underground or not, would not be so straightforward, especially since his quirk was unreliable. Even as an underground hero, he knew he couldn't keep his quirk a secret forever. Rumors would circulate in the villain world, just as they had for 𝐼𝐼𝐻𝐿. It wasn't a concern since Hero Corps students didn't wear their costumes during televised competitions, and most underground heroes wore masks as well. However, the more villains he apprehended, the more his quirk would become known. It was inevitable. The fluorescent lights in the stairwell stung his eyes, and the sunlight in the stands was no better. He squinted as he took a seat next to Midoriya, hoping it wasn't too obvious that he was sitting on the edge. He had noticed Midoriya doing the same before. He would have preferred to leave a seat between them, but he sensed that Midoriya might think he no longer wanted to sit beside him, especially since Hitoshi was frustrated that Midoriya hadn't utilized his quirk enough. Midoriya seemed overly concerned about his quirk. Hitoshi wondered what it would take to make him stop worrying or to accept it. If everyone treated him like a villain regardless of whether he used his quirk, why bother trying to be nice? Using it would simplify things just as it had for Hitoshi. When Midoriya had started to express his distress during the second round, Hitoshi had felt a strong urge to shake him. But what 𝗟𝗶𝐻𝐸 had done to him was far worse than Hitoshi's own experiences. Perhaps if someone had mistreated him, he would have felt the same way about his quirk. Midoriya smiled at him, complimenting his performance. Hitoshi acknowledged the praise, running a hand through his damp hair. He then inquired about the wolf girl. Midoriya explained that he had met her during the entrance exams when she was taking the written portion in the adjacent classroom. Hitoshi was grateful that Midoriya never pressed him for more details. He simply made educated guesses, allowing Hitoshi a moment to correct him if needed. Others often demanded clarification, as if they should inherently understand him, which frustrated him. It shouldn't have been so difficult for them. His unique way of speaking hadn't originated from laziness. It had started as a means to connect with others. In junior high, he had found that people were hesitant to approach him, including teachers. So, he had decided to speak less. However, making friends without talking proved to be even more challenging, leading him to adopt a habit of speaking even less. It was a difficult pattern to break, and he felt that if someone couldn't understand him, they didn't deserve to know. Midoriya continued, sharing that 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐃 had been their proctor and had arrived late, causing them to wait outside the classroom. They had talked for a while, and Hitoshi had been surprised to learn that 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐃 was a teacher at U. He hadn't recognized the hero initially, as there were few images of him online, and those that existed often obscured his face. Hitoshi was intrigued to learn that 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐃 was also one of Midoriya's favorite heroes. It was astonishing to think that Hitoshi's favorite pro was in the same building as them, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment that he wasn't training under 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐃 due to a biased entrance exam. Midoriya then noticed Hitoshi's hands and expressed concern about whether they had been hurt. Hitoshi reassured him that he would consider seeing Recovery Girl after his next match, if he lost. Midoriya froze at the implication, quickly clarifying that he didn't want Hitoshi to lose. Hitoshi leaned closer to Midoriya but caught himself and leaned back, stating that he didn't want to fight Bakugo. Midoriya looked down, his hands clasped together, occasionally glancing at Hitoshi. He seemed worried about what Hitoshi might do, which puzzled him. Hitoshi urged Midoriya to share his thoughts, and after a moment of hesitation, Midoriya nodded slowly. Hitoshi accepted the silence and turned his attention back to the next match, knowing that whoever won would be his next opponent. The upcoming fight featured Yaoyorozu, a girl with a creation quirk, and Monoma, who had a quirk that was a poor imitation of Midoriya's. Both were hero core students, likely to be irritating. To Hitoshi's surprise, Yaoyorozu emerged victorious, which was embarrassing for Monoma, who had boasted about his multiple quirks. If Hitoshi had been granted such a quirk, he would have used it effectively. Even Midoriya seemed to agree with him, albeit in a more subtle manner. After their match, there was an hour-long break. Midoriya and Hitoshi spent it in the cafeteria, which was reserved for students and teachers. Midoriya secured a table at the end of a row, one where he felt more at ease. Hitoshi didn't mind where they sat. He wasn't particularly fond of encountering people who lacked the awareness to respect his personal space. When they left early to return to the stands before the crowd arrived, Midoriya quietly excused himself to go to the bathroom. He nearly collided with the bathroom door in his haste. Hitoshi figured he wouldn't see Midoriya again until after Todoroki and Bakugo's match. He was correct. Midoriya didn't return until Present Mic announced Bakugo as the winner, the crowd's cheers ringing in his ears. It was almost amusing how little they seemed to care about Bakugo's aggressive approach. Almost. Todoroki had put up a commendable fight with his ice, but Bakugo had been relentless, wearing a scowl as if he believed victory was only valid if it came with a serious injury. The sight of a competitor being taken away on a stretcher didn't seem to satisfy him. When Hitoshi remarked on this, Midoriya simply stated that Bakugo needed to recognize he had won against someone who had given their all. Hitoshi had anticipated leaving the fight with a few burns, fully aware of what a match with Bakugo could entail. He believed he could catch Bakugo off guard. If he could just get Bakugo to mention what he had done to Midoriya, it would be enough. All Hitoshi needed was a single word to start the conversation, but it would be challenging to cut him off afterward. Perhaps he could even manipulate Bakugo into revealing everything. Midoriya would likely disapprove of that strategy. However, if Bakugo had hurt him, it was Hitoshi's responsibility to report it. Bakugo had already left a burn mark on Midoriya's shirt, and Hitoshi doubted that such incidents in the past would explain Midoriya's current behavior. Villains had no place at U. Midoriya waved goodbye, quietly wishing Hitoshi luck, probably in losing. It didn't matter. On stage, Hitoshi performed some last-minute stretches. He had intentionally eaten lightly during lunch to avoid feeling sluggish. In fact, he felt surprisingly good, better than usual. With his typical caffeine intake, he might even say he didn't feel like collapsing the moment he hit the ground. As Present Mic introduced him and Yaoyorozu, she unzipped her PE shirt. While she kept it on, she parted it to reveal a sports bra. Was she preparing for something? Or was she planning to create something too large for her arms when the match began? Hitoshi inquired about her plans. She covered her mouth with her hand, prompting Hitoshi to scoff, advising her not to overthink it. She narrowed her eyes but kept her hand in place. Hitoshi remarked that he almost felt sorry for Todoroki, questioning whether all Hero Corps students got away with everything or just Bakugo. She offered no response. When the match commenced, the first item Yaoyorozu produced was a STRP of duct tape, which she pressed to her mouth. Hitoshi couldn't help but laugh a little. Was she serious? At least he wouldn't have to waste his breath anymore. He wasn't about to wait for her to create something else. He charged at her, and she made no effort to stop him. He drove his hands into her shoulders, pushing her backward. As she tipped over, he stumbled, leaping over her to avoid tripping. His awkward landing on his knees was uncomfortable, but he managed to avoid touching the line. She attempted to push him backward, so he dove to the side. The concrete was unforgiving, even when his roll was executed perfectly. Wincing, he stood up, turned to face her, and brushed a strand of hair from his eyes. Hitoshi waited for her next move. When she launched herself forward, he sprang into action. She threw a punch, which he dodged while simultaneously driving the heel of his palm into her ribs. She stumbled back, gasping for breath. He chose not to pursue her. Closer to the line but not quite there, she lifted her arm, producing a pair of 𝐻𝐻𝐷𝐶FFs from her forearm. She caught them as they slid off and gripped them tightly in her right hand. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. Those again. They might have worked on that student from Class 1B, but not on him. He expected her to be more inventive. She charged at him, clutching the cuffs. When she was within range, she lunged for his wrist. He blocked her attack with one arm and seized her wrist to keep the cuffs at bay. This fight was different from his sparring sessions with Midoriya. She didn't know how to retract her punches quickly enough. He landed a quick jab to her side and pulled her closer with a firm grip on her forearm. As she stumbled, he twisted, sliding his back foot around in a half circle. With a hand pressing against the back of her neck, he guided her to the ground. He could have redirected her momentum to push her out of bounds or at least closer to the line. But weakening her first wouldn't hurt. Without her quirk, she wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight, and he was more experienced in combat without quirks. Still, he backed off, aware that he couldn't allow her to cuff his ankles. He also didn't want to force her to the ground. Villains would be eager to do that, so she needed some experience. She wouldn't learn to defend herself properly if everyone went easy on her in training. However, the audience wouldn't appreciate him overpowering someone they deemed helpless, especially not with his quirk. She struggled to her feet, cuffs still in hand. Her arms and face were dirted from the fall, and one side of her face was red and scratched, likely from scraping against the concrete. Her hair had mostly come undone from its ponytail. Hitoshi's hair was in disarray as well, and he had to brush a few strands back to keep it from falling into his eyes. This time, she was the one to attack him. She approached from the side, as if that would improve her chances. It was farther from the nearest white line, but she couldn't evade Hitoshi's counterattacks. She ducked under his punch and aimed for an uppercut, which he blocked before it could gain any power. Her uppercut was followed by a hook, which he leaned back to avoid. Again, she didn't retract her punch quickly enough. He seized her wrist, pressed his thumbs against the back of her hand, and pushed it in the opposite direction. To escape the pain, she let herself fall to the ground, but she didn't twist enough. Hitoshi maintained slight pressure on her hand, ensuring she couldn't easily escape. The cuffs she had been holding fell to the ground as she loosened her grip. Midoriya had learned a technique from a jiu-jitsu video, which he had taught to Hitoshi after mstring it on him. It was a risky move that could easily injure someone if applied with too much force. Hitoshi was careful not to go that far, but it was still enough to cause discomfort. With her back on the ground, she attempted to struggle, but a gentle pressure on her hand made her stop. In a few moments, she would concede, and Midnight could declare her incapacitated. Hitoshi thought that was the end of it until the girl moved her other arm, grasped his ankle, and something dark oozed from her hand. It resembled tar, sliding down his ankle slowly. She produced enough of it to make it hit the ground before he could free his leg. Once it adhered him to the floor, She effortlessly pulled her hand away and stepped back to admire her handiwork. It had even coated part of his breathed leg, leaving him with no hope of escape. Tugging on his foot didn't budge the substance at all. Hitoshi glared at her as she slowly peeled away the tape covering her mouth. She had already won, and there was no point in trying to brainwash her now. Midnight announced Yaoyorozu as the winner, and Hitoshi scowled. As she worked to remove the tar, Hitoshi stared up at Class 1A's section in the stands. He couldn't see Bakugo from that distance, but he knew he was up there. He wouldn't get his chance to confront Bakugo now, but he was determined it would come. If it didn't happen naturally, Hitoshi would make it happen. He wasn't striving to become a hero just to let a villain slip away. Izuku peeked out of the door of Class 1C, scanning each person who passed, searching for the distinct split hair of Shudo Todoroki. It had been 3 days since the sports festival, and he had a good reason for waiting. They hadn't had school the day after the festival to allow the competitors to rest. The following day, he had tried to find Todoroki after school, but when he emerged from his homeroom, Bakugo was right behind him. Izuku didn't want to ruin Bakugo's week any more than it already had been. Bakugo had not taken kindly to winning the festival, especially since Todoroki hadn't used his fire. Thankfully, Todoroki had escaped his fight without any lasting injuries. Izuku was relieved that 𝐶INSO lost to Yaoyorozu. Not that he wanted 𝐶INSO to lose, but if he had won, Bakugo could have caused serious harm. How would he become a hero then? Bakugo fighting Yaoyorozu minimized the overall damage. He hadn't needed to do much to incapacitate her, and from what 𝐶INSO had told him, she hadn't even needed to visit Recovery Girl. She had lost quickly. Even after losing to Yaoyorozu, 𝐶INSO had secured 3rd place. Izuku was aware that few General Corps students ever made it to the 2nd event, and even fewer advanced to the 3rd. In the last 20 sports festivals, not a single General Corps student had appeared on the podium. Therefore, Izuku felt confident that 𝐶INSO would get another chance to demonstrate his potential to transfer. They had decided to take the week off from sparring to recover. As soon as Izuku mentioned he would be staying a little longer, 𝐶INSO left with a casual wave. The first students to exit Class 1A were Uraraka and a broad-shouldered boy who exuded the aura of a class president. He was the one who had confidently scolded Bakugo during the festival. Izuku ducked back inside Class 1C to avoid being seen. A few more students wandered out, engrossed in their conversations. Todoroki was the next to leave, and after ensuring Bakugo wasn't behind him, Izuku slipped into the hallway. He navigated through the crowd, dodging anyone who looked ready to bump into him. His skin began to itch when he brushed against someone, prompting him to quicken his pace until he reached the wall where Todoroki was almost pressed against it. Todoroki didn't seem uncomfortable with the crowd but appeared displeased with the number of people he had to maneuver around. Izuku awkwardly greeted Todoroki and fell into step beside him, slowing his pace to keep him in sight. He wanted to talk for a moment if that was all right. Todoroki stared at him for a few tense seconds. Before Izuku could stammer out an apology and excuse himself, Todoroki agreed. Izuku suggested they go down the hall, and Todoroki turned left toward the middle hall that opened into the building's atrium. It had always felt too open for him. Staircases wrapped around all 4 sides, leading up to the 10th floor one at a time. In the center, illuminated by light streaming through the glass ceiling, was a collection of desks and tables surrounded by chairs in solid colors of blue, yellow, and red colors. Students typically used the side stairwells, as they were closer to the classrooms, resulting in a considerably less crowded area. Izuku led Todoroki to the atrium and turned left as soon as he could. After taking a few more steps, he pressed his back against the wall. While he could have led them to the chairs, their position provided multiple exits, and knowing someone couldn't sneak up behind him was reassuring. Todoroki asked if there was a reason for bringing him there. Izuku took a deep breath and explained that during the sports festival, Todoroki had mentioned he couldn't use his fire because it was his father's. Todoroki acknowledged this and elaborated on Quirk marriages, explaining how his mother had been forced into one. He shared the story of his 𝐼𝐼𝐻 and how he was created to surpass all might, a goal his father had never achieved. He revealed how his mother, and ultimately his father, was responsible for his scar and how his siblings had been kept away from him because they lacked the perfect combination of ice and fire. His father had trained him nearly every day, but it was less about training and more about harsh treatment. Izuku felt a heavy weight in his chest as Todoroki concluded his story, his expression remaining as emotionless as ever, as if he were merely presenting facts for a school assignment. It was hard for Izuku to comprehend how someone could distance themselves so thoroughly from their past, speaking of it with such calmness. He couldn't fathom the depth of pain Todoroki had endured, or the struggles he continued to face. While Izuku understood what it felt like to be hurt by someone close, the betrayal of a childhood friend and the actions of a father were not the same. Being born to fulfill another's ambitions was a burden Izuku couldn't imagine. His own mother had always been cautious about his dreams, but her concern stemmed from love and a longing for his safety. Izuku expressed his sympathy for Todoroki, acknowledging that he didn't deserve the hardships he had faced. Todoroki explained that his refusal to use his left side was a declaration of independence from his father. Izuku felt compelled to reassure him, stating that he was not his father and that his powers belonged to him alone. If Izuku were to use his quirk on Todoroki, he would not be taking anything from his father, it would simply be a matter of harnessing Todoroki's own abilities. Todoroki regarded him with a mixture of surprise and contemplation, and Izuku realized he had been frustrated with Todoroki for rejecting his own quirk, just as he had done himself. He reflected on his own missed opportunities during the festival, wishing he had taken more risks and utilized his quirk more effectively. He recognized that he needed to embrace his abilities if he wanted to become a hero capable of saving lives. Izuku complimented Todoroki's quirk, emphasizing its heroic nature and encouraging him to take pride in it. Todoroki remained silent, studying Izuku as if trying to understand him better. Izuku felt out of place, uncertain if he should be the one to challenge Todoroki's mindset. He shifted nervously, waiting for a response, unsure if he truly needed one. Finally, Todoroki affirmed that his powers were indeed his own. Izuku felt a rush of enthusiasm, though he quickly felt embarrassed by his own excitement. He excused himself, hurrying down the hallway, aware of the discomfort from his bandaged shoulder. On his way home, he planned to stop at a convenience store for more supplies, having used up much of what he had in recent days. As he turned at the main gate, he glanced back to see Todoroki in the distance, and he quickly looked away. Izuku hoped his words had made an impact, but he understood that change had to come from within. They both needed to embrace their quirks, not shy away from them, for the sake of helping others. For days after the sports festival, Izuku found himself in Midnight's history class, diligently taking notes. He was careful not to fidget, aware that his classmates had become more distant since revealing his quirk. From his seat at the back, he noticed 𝐶INSO struggling to stay awake, likely overwhelmed by the upcoming midterms. 𝐶INSO was the type who could manage decent grades with minimal effort, often relying on last-minute studying. Izuku had been lending 𝐶INSO pencils, as he tended to misplace them. He always kept extras for himself, knowing how important they were for his own studies. Unlike 𝐶INSO, Izuku felt the pressure to stay on top of his work, especially at 𝐒𝐮𝐬, where he was finally receiving fair evaluations. He was determined to excel, knowing that his efforts would pay off in the long run. Japanese was the only class where Izuku excelled, as it was graded on essays that allowed students ample time to write. When the clock indicated that there were 3 minutes left, he began to pack his backpack. This habit had yet to fade, and he hadn't made any effort to change it. It provided a sense of comfort, knowing he could leave at a moment's notice. The bell chimed over the intercom, and while their classmates hurried to gather their belongings and exit, Izuku and 𝐶INSO remained seated. Midnight announced that everyone should have a good day and reminded them to finish their essays by tomorrow. She then asked Izuku and 𝐶INSO to stay after class for a moment. Ignoring the curious glances from their classmates, 𝐶INSO and Izuku waited by Midnight's desk, which she was watching intently. Eventually, 𝐼𝐻𝐸 entered the room, his gaze initially fixed on the ground before meeting 𝐶INSO's and then Izuku's. He wore his hero costume, looking as if he had just rolled out of bed, with one side of his shoulder-length hair appearing particularly messy. Midnight introduced him as Mr. Izuku, Class 1A's homeroom teacher. Izuku understood why Mr. Izuku used his real name, unlike most of their other teachers. As an underground hero, it was wise to keep his identity discreet, although he didn't seem overly concerned about hiding it. Mr. Izuku informed them that classes 1A and 1B would be attending a week-long training camp over the break to develop their quirks. He emphasized that if they were serious about transferring, this would be their opportunity to prove themselves. He handed them each a sheet of paper, instructing them to get a parent's signature and warning them not to fail their exams, as that would prevent them from attending. With that, he exited the room. Once alone, 𝐼𝐮𝐲 and Izuku exchanged a look that was markedly different from the first. After a moment of silence, 𝐼𝐮𝐲 smiled, and Izuku soon followed suit. They had done it. The remainder of the term passed quickly, with 𝐼𝐮𝐲 and Izuku resuming their sparring sessions 3 times a week. Their opportunities for more training would come after their written finals. Izuku began studying 3 weeks in advance, primarily on his own but occasionally with 𝐼𝐮𝐲. He assisted 𝐼𝐮𝐲 with Japanese and English while 𝐼𝐮𝐲 helped him with algebra. However, their study sessions were infrequent, as both preferred to study alone. The exam for their quirk studies was structured as a project. Each student was to choose a partner and analyze their quirk, exploring its potential applications in various career fields and hero work. 𝐼𝐮𝐲 approached Izuku, who had hoped they would be partners but had been too anxious to ask. To distract himself from the fact that 𝐼𝐮𝐲 would be analyzing his quirk, Izuku focused on the excitement of analyzing 𝐼𝐮𝐲's quirk in depth. During the second-to-last week, Izuku dedicated his time to developing a comprehensive analysis of 𝐼𝐮𝐲's quirk. He structured it similarly to his hero analysis journals, including a rough sketch of 𝐼𝐮𝐲 alongside a potential hero costume design. Underneath the sketch, he detailed his design choices, aiming for a minimalistic style suitable for an underground hero that reflected 𝐼𝐮𝐲's personal flair. Notes filled the page, leaving no blank space. Izuku found himself particularly challenged by the design of 𝐼𝐮𝐲's hero costume. While the base was straightforward, determining useful support items required more thought. Although Mr. Terumi hadn't demanded such a level of detail, Izuku welcomed the project as a chance to take a break from his other studies. He hoped that if he could devise something beneficial, it might help 𝐼𝐮𝐲 on his journey to becoming a hero, a way to repay him for his patience. Initially, Izuku considered a simple idea, like a speaker that could be worn around 𝐼𝐮𝐲's neck to amplify his voice. However, he quickly dismissed it, recalling 𝐼𝐮𝐲's explanation that any alteration to his voice would prevent his quirk from activating. Next, he pondered a device that could enhance his voice without converting it into an electronic signal. He questioned whether such a device was feasible, and if it could be compacted into a mask that only covered 𝐼𝐮𝐲's mouth or served multiple functions. It had to be practical, especially since 𝐼𝐮𝐲 relied on close combat when his quirk was ineffective. Izuku then contemplated other uses for the mask to make it truly valuable. If it could amplify 𝐼𝐮𝐲's voice, could it also modify it in other ways? Making it quieter wouldn't be helpful, so he brainstormed further. Then, an idea struck him. What if he created a device he called artificial vocal cords? As soon as he sketched a rough design resembling a mask, he decided to call 𝐼𝐮𝐲. Although it was somewhat late, he knew 𝐼𝐮𝐲 would still be awake and would answer if he wanted to talk. After a few rings, 𝐼𝐮𝐲 picked up. Izuku felt a bit awkward but was relieved that 𝐼𝐮𝐲's tone suggested he wasn't truly upset. This was why Izuku preferred phone calls. He could gauge emotions through voice, unlike text messages. He apologized for the late call and explained that he had been working on their project and thought of a support item. He described his idea for a mask that could change 𝐮𝐲's voice to sound like someone else, such as an ally of his opponent. They would respond to him without even realizing it. He had considered that possibility before and assumed it would be electronic. Izuku suggested that if anyone would know, it would be 𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐸. He shook his pencil between his fingers, recalling how excited she seemed when he mentioned seeking her help for future support items. He believed she would be thrilled to build something for 𝐮𝐲 if she thought it was feasible, as it would give her a chance to indulge in her passion. 𝐮𝐲 agreed to think about it, stating he would look into it tomorrow. Just as Izuku was about to accept that and awkwardly end the conversation, 𝗪𝐻 asked if it was possible to transfer quirks to others. Izuku felt a jolt of surprise. He had never attempted to give someone else a quirk before. 𝗪𝐻 pressed him further about the transfer, and Izuku hesitated, feeling uncomfortable. He doubted he would ever need to transfer his quirk, but the idea of knowing if it was possible intrigued him, even if it was a little unsettling. He mulled over the implications of a permanent quirk transfer. No one would willingly give up their quirk, and he certainly wouldn't want to take one. 𝗪𝐻's mention of a quirk that had been used to cause harm made Izuku uneasy. He had promised himself to be better, to avoid the path of taking someone else's abilities for his own gain. He resolved that if it were truly necessary, he would do it only if the person agreed and would ensure they were genuinely willing. 𝗪𝐻's comment about Izuku being terrifying lingered in his mind, but he brushed it off. He tried to convince himself that he didn't care what others thought, but deep down he did. After their conversation ended, Izuku felt a mix of disappointment and relief. He had expected 𝗪𝐻 to hang up quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their talk had some significance. As he reflected on their interactions, he wondered if 𝗪𝐻 was truly his friend or if he felt obligated to talk to him out of fear. It didn't make sense to him. 𝗪𝐻 had shown willingness to support him, even during the sports festival. Despite their differences, he had chosen to ally with Izuku, which suggested a level of trust. Izuku folded 𝗪𝐻's quirk analysis pages and returned them to his binder, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He had finished studying for the night, but with time still left before bed, he turned to his trusted knife, knowing he had enough supplies for any minor mishaps. The next morning, he prepared for school, tying his tie as usual and heading out with the intention of learning more about his quirk, with 𝗪𝐻 and 𝗏𝐼kyu's help. 𝗪𝐻 didn't bring up the idea of a permanent quirk again, and Izuku felt relieved. He had been honest the night before. A permanent quirk would allow him to fight without relying solely on his ability to touch his opponent. Instead of discussing quirk transfers, 𝗪𝐻 spent the time after class encouraging 𝗏𝗏 to approach Izuku's desk. When 𝗪𝐻 explained his plan, 𝗏𝗏 looked to Izuku for clarification, which he provided. 𝗏𝗏 seemed genuinely interested in the outcome, and with that, Izuku stepped forward to attempt to take frost breath from him. He hesitated but then backed up, placing his hand on 𝗪𝐻's wrist and envisioning the transfer of frost breath into him. With no way to confirm if it had worked, Izuku could only hope for the best. 𝗪𝐻 exhaled deeply, causing both Izuku and 𝗏𝗏 to shiver as the breath shimmered in the light. 𝗏𝗏 expressed his admiration for the situation, prompting a curious glance from Izuku. He explained that the ability to help others was a significant aspect of having a quirk. Izuku hesitated, uncertain about the frequency of opportunities to assist someone by transferring a quirk. 𝗏𝗏 shrugged, suggesting that one could never predict such moments. He then encouraged Izuku to attempt giving him his quirk, eager to experience it for himself. Izuku felt a wave of reluctance. He sensed that 𝗏𝗏's interest in his quirk was not driven by villainous intentions, especially given the look on 𝗪𝐻's face, which mirrored his own apprehension. The thought crossed Izuku's mind that if 𝗏𝗏 wanted to use his quirk, perhaps he didn't see it as something to fear. Was 𝗏𝗏's excitement about the temporary nature of the transfer, or did he have other motives in mind? Izuku didn't believe 𝗏𝗏 would want to hoard the quirk, especially since he had allowed Izuku to take his quirk in the first place. After a moment of contemplation, Izuku agreed to the transfer. As he reached out, he hesitated, grappling with the strange longing to hold onto a quirk he had long wished away. With a slightly trembling hand, he pressed his palm against 𝗏𝗏's forearm, visualizing his quirk flowing into him. Once he stepped back, a tingling sensation lingered on his hand. Although it was less uncomfortable to initiate contact than to be on the receiving end, it still felt odd. He had only ever touched others to take their quirks. Izuku instructed 𝗏𝗏 to try reclaiming his quirk from 𝗪𝐻, guiding him to visualize pulling frost breath back into himself. 𝗏𝗏 nodded and placed his hand on 𝗪𝐻's wrist, then hopped onto the desk behind him, exhaling softly into his hand. He was delighted to discover that the transfer had worked, expressing his surprise and acknowledging the power he now possessed. Izuku averted his gaze, focusing on the shoes of 𝗪𝐻 and 𝗏𝗏. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 elaborated on the potential of his newfound ability, suggesting it was powerful enough to conquer the world. He reassured Izuku that it was fortunate he had the quirk, as he trusted him not to misuse it. Izuku looked up, bewildered by 𝐼𝐻𝐬's confidence. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 explained that while some classmates feared Izuku might take their quirks, he believed Izuku would never do such a thing. Izuku sought confirmation, feeling the need to hear those reassuring words once more. As 𝐼𝐻𝐬 leaned forward to place a hand on Izuku's arm, he then stepped back and returned to the floor. He approached 𝗟𝗟 to ensure that quirk transfer had been successfully returned. Izuku felt a small smile forming on his face, realizing that perhaps there was a silver lining to having his quirk after all.